Good morning, and thank you for standing by. My name is Joseph O'Brien, and I am the Indian Arts Student Coordinator here at Eastern Oregon University. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm from the Pit River Tribe, located in Northern California, and I have been living in Oregon for the past 5 years. I'm currently a sophomore here at the La Grande Extension for the Oregon Health and Science University School of Nursing. On behalf of the Seed Planning Committee, I would like to welcome you to the 10th annual Celebrate, Educate, and Appreciate Diversity virtual gathering. I'm joined today by Joya Wong, a student intern for the Office of Student Diversity and Inclusion.
Thank you, Joseph. Ali Malungil Tutao. Good morning, everyone. My name is Choya Wong, and I am this school year's student intern for the Office of Student Diversity and Inclusion. I am from the Republic of Palau, and I major in sociology with a concentration on social welfare. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. I am excited and thankful for the opportunity to be one of your MCs today. And I'm also very thankful that you have taken the time out of your weekend to be here to continue learning and to share time with us. As you can see from the pie chart, half of our participants joining us today are EOU students, 17% are faculty and staff, and about 33% of the participants are EOU alumni and community members from various parts of Oregon. These parts include rural communities to urban parts of our state, from Ontario, Vail, Haines, Portland, Corvallis, Bend, and Ashland. We even have participants from the states of Idaho, Washington, California, Alaska, and St. Louis, Missouri. Having such a diverse virtual community presence at our 10th annual C.E.A.D Conference this year really speaks to the value of what we're doing, the commitment, support, and need for these spaces. Lastly, it illustrates the impact of our reach and the support we have for the conference. So thank you all for being a part of making this conference a success. We would like to also take a moment to recognize and acknowledge that February is Black History Month. It was only in 1976 that the United States of America began to collectively celebrate Black history and the significance of the contributions of African Americans in our nation's history. However, the lives, contributions, and aspirations of countless African Americans and African immigrants have left a significant mark upon American history. In nearly 530 years of what is considered American and our US history, we as a nation have committed some of the most heinous infractions against African Americans and African immigrants, ranging from the transatlantic slave trade to the war over slavery in the American Civil War, Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights Movement, and now into the summer of 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement. Yet, African Americans and African immigrants have persisted to create communities, survive, and thrive. As it is Black History Month, we want to acknowledge, center, and elevate these histories, accomplishments, and aspirations of our African American and African immigrant community, and take a moment to celebrate and acknowledge their central role in our nation's history. Thank you.
Before we officially start our program, we have some housekeeping items and a short overview of today's schedule. We will begin with a land acknowledgement, followed by welcoming remarks delivered by one of our students. Then we'll welcome our keynote speaker, Tim Wise, followed by a short Q&A session. Immediately after the Q&A, we will have a short break and then come back to enjoy a presentation by social justice spoken word poet Matt Sedillo. We will then hear from our closing speaker, Javier Cervantes, Director for Institutional Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Lynn Benton Community College. After the closing speaker, we invite participants to join us for a short processing and debriefing time. A separate link and instructions for the post-C.E.A.D conversation will be shared towards the end of the program. In this webinar, all participants are on listen-only mode. Please be advised today's conference is being recorded. Use the chat feature in Zoom to share your comment with the entire group. To submit your comment, simply click the chat button on the control bar at the bottom of your screen. At this time, we would like to share our community agreements. A community agreement is a shared agreement about how we want to share the space we are in as we learn and grow together. It helps us identify concrete ways to create an inclusive community and to talk through difficult conversations while minimalizing conflict. Using these practices, we can intentionally challenge ourselves and each other while still recognizing the different experiences we all come from. First, stay engaged and be fully present. Investing in the time to be present and staying engaged allows you to maximize this opportunity to listen and learn even when you feel confused or uncomfortable. Pay attention to when you are shutting down or not wanting to listen and use strategies to help you stay present. Discomfort and anxiety are normal parts of courageous conversations and learning. If what is being said creates an emotional response in you, be extra aware and challenge yourself to listen and be open-minded to hearing the full intent and meaning of what is being shared. Allyship is about actively reframing knowledge and actively changing power dynamics. Second, keep an open mind and listen with intent. As you listen to our speakers share their knowledge and experiences, it's important to keep an open mind as you actively listen with intent. Keeping an open mind allows for growth by learning from mistakes, allowing to participate more in difficult conversations with a growth mindset. As you move through your own self-reflection today, please remember to be kind and have compassion for yourself. Stepping out of your comfort zone is scary and disorienting sometimes. You're bound to make mistakes, and that's okay.
Third, I'd like to ask that you lean into your discomfort. One way to think about this is learn to become comfortable with the discomfort. As we intentionally lean into difficult and uncomfortable conversations, we acknowledge that our individual and collective learning is going to be difficult, even a bit messy, and will happen over time. Sometimes our values and the way we understand things will be challenged, and we acknowledge that process of unlearning ideas and beliefs can be uncomfortable. And lastly, expect and accept non-closure. Engaging in diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations means there will be times of no closure. It is because this is an ongoing work that does not necessarily leave one walking away feeling like everything turned out the way you had hoped. Be willing to take risks and accept that much of this is about changing yourself and not others. Therefore, we must commit to an ongoing dialogue and a journey to grow together. Moving forward, I would like to welcome one of our student leaders from ASCOU, Director of Diversity, Vitor Pedrosa, to lead us in our community and tribal acknowledgement. Vitor.
Thank you, Joya. As I already mentioned, my name is Vitor Pedrosa and I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm currently a junior studying computer science and mathematics. I was born and raised in Brazil, but moved to America at a very young age. I'm very thankful to be here today. We acknowledge that there are institutional, systemic, and structural barriers that perpetuate inequity that have silenced the voices of communities over time. We are committed to partnerships, co-creation, and co-ownerships of solutions with communities whose voices and identities are underrepresented in the educational system. We are striving to engage with BIPOC and other underrepresented communities through deliberate, structured, emerging, and best practice processes, especially with students in communities that experience institutional, systemic, and structural barriers. Since Eastern Oregon University is the host institution for today's virtual gathering, we acknowledge that now what we call La Grande, Oregon and Union County are the ancestral lands of the Nez Perce, Nimiipuu, Cayuse, Umatilla, and the Walla Walla, who made their homes throughout the Grand Ronde Valley. We celebrate their tradition, languages, and stories. We acknowledge their continuing connection to this land, water, and community, and pay our respects to these original stewards of Northeast Oregon. Acknowledging the land is a transformative act that recognizes the erasure of the indigenous peoples. To commemorate their connection ties to this land, to encourage people to think about what it means to occupy space on indigenous lands, and to show gratitude and pay our respects to indigenous communities in the place that we gather. It is equally important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to live and work on the land and to seek to understand our place within the history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in past tense or historical context. Colonialism is an ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. We invite you to take a moment to recognize and honor the traditional indigenous people of the land upon which you reside.
Thank you, Vitor. I would now like to turn it over to Andrea Camacho, an EOU senior and former ASEOU Director of Diversity and Equity, to share some words and celebrate the life of a dear friend, mentor, and Director of TRIO Student Services, Michael Williams, who passed away on December 31st, 2020. Go ahead, Andrea.
Thank you, Joseph. Half a day to the woman, and hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Camacho, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm from Saipan of the Northern Mariana Islands, and I'm a current senior here at Eastern Oregon University. I'm studying health and human performance, concentrating in community health. Last year, I was the previous director for diversity and equity. I was also a TRIO mentor and a diversity excellence mentor with the Student Diversity and Inclusion Office. I'm involved with multicultural clubs here at EOU, and I love being a part of the C.E.A.D Conference like every year. When I attended the conference my freshman year, I got a deep and insightful connection to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. I fell in love with the work of C.E.A.D Conference and attended like every year after that. It's very bittersweet of me to say that this is my final C.E.A.D Conference at EOU as a student and student leader. In honor of this year's C.E.A.D Conference, we would like to commemorate, honor, and dedicate this special conference to our beloved friend, mentor, and TRIO Student Support Services Director, Michael A. Williams. During a late evening of December 31st, 2020, the world lost Mr. Mike Williams, a significant and astounding member of the EOU community. Michael Williams was the advisor of the Black Student Union. He DJ'd at our campus's KEOL local radio station, and he had a great passion for social justice, diversity, inclusion, and equity work in the community. Michael Williams was more than an esteemed member he was kind, he was warm, he was welcoming, and he always knew the right things to say. More than that, he was a hero. At least he was mine and to other students on this campus. This is the part where I tell you a little story of how I got the honor and privilege of knowing Mike Williams personally. So about a little over 3 years ago, I was a new freshman, straight out of high school from Saipan, with little to no knowledge about what EOU had in store for me, honestly. I remember walking to his office. I was homesick, I was depressed, I was sad and in tears because truthfully, I was on the verge of dropping out. To give this story some more context of some of the reasons why I was sad, well, to start off, the time I didn't know any better, so I was taking 21 credits. I had almost no money or financial support after paying my first term of college. And there are not very many people that looked like me that I trusted at that time. But Mike's door was open. It was always open. And I can tell you this, the best decision I ever made in my college journey was walking straight through that open door and having a conversation with him of why I deserve to be a student of color in higher education. Sorry, guys. You know, he had a way with words. He knew how to uplift anyone he ever talked to, and he always gave the best advice. Conversations with Mike can range anywhere from social justice matters to talking about the Cowboys football team. He talked about K-pop, K-drama. He talked about cultural differences. He was always welcoming to whatever subject came his way and always listened with respect, dignity, and compassion. Michael Williams was a phenomenal mentor and a friend who had the biggest heart. He never made it feel like you're being judged for anything. And he always had a way with words. He always had words of wisdom to share. He was everything that this conference advocates for: inclusion, equity, and unity through uplifting others. It is an honor and a privilege to get to dedicate this year's C.E.A.D Conference to Michael Williams. Let's take a couple seconds right now to dedicate a moment of silence for him. May you rest in peace, love, and power, Mike. Thank you, C.E.A.D coordinators, for inviting me to come and speak. Let's move forward with the conference.
Thank you, Andrea. Michael Williams was an important part of our campus, and we are so thankful for you being here to share your experiences, as well as the impact Mike had on so many students and our entire campus community. It's clear that 2020 was a tumultuous year for our planet and for our global communities. Each of us were and continue to be impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. 2020 was also a year of reckoning when various social justice movements took center stage and activism became more and more a part of our lives. In looking back at 2020 through the lens of social justice, it's clear that the global pandemic has highlighted long-standing issues such as racism, voter suppression, hunger, food insecurities, access to healthcare, systemic racism within the criminal justice system, income gap, education gap, and so many others that have plagued many communities, especially communities of color. It's becoming increasingly hard to ignore that these issues and barriers are independent of each other. It's clear that each issue is connected with each other and in some way impacts all of us. We can begin to better understand the ways in which we are all connected to these issues and how each of us can be the change by examining our own beliefs and values, educating ourselves about social justice issues, and most importantly, being willing to be uncomfortable as we make an intentional decision to grow. As you listen to our presenters today, I invite you to acknowledge this feeling of uncomfortableness. Lean in and push past your comfort zone, as being uncomfortable leads to growth. Finally, don't quit. We are all in this together. Transformation and growth require discomfort, unease, and making mistakes.
Thank you, Joe and Andrea. Without further ado, we are truly honored to welcome Mr. Tim Wise to our 10th annual C.E.A.D Conference at Eastern Oregon University this year. Wise is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. He spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states on over 1,500 colleges and high school campuses, at hundreds of professionals and academic conferences, and to community groups across the country. Wise has also trained corporate, government, entertainment, media, law enforcement, military, and medical industry professionals on methods for dismantling racial inequity in their institutions. He has also provided anti-racism training to educators and administrators nationwide and internationally in Canada through Bermuda. Wise is the author of 9 books, including his latest, Dispatches from the Race War. Other books include Under the Affluence, Showing the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America, Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority, Colorblind, his highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections and Race from a Privileged Son, Affirmative Action, Racial Preference in Black and White, Speaking Treason Fluently, Anti-Racist Reflections from an Angry White Male, and Between Barack and Hard Place, Racism and White Denial in the Age of Obama. Through DEI events such as the annual C.E.A.D Conference at Eastern Oregon University, it is our goal to intentionally create a space for meaningful dialogue and a space of personal growth for our students, faculty, and staff. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Tim Wise.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction. Let me first off start by doing a little bit of a disclaimer since we're doing this virtually. Obviously, it's sort of the new normal right now. I need to make a very clear announcement that I am not technologically skilled in the least. My technological prowess ended sometime around 1981 with Atari video games. Anything more recent than that, probably not very good at it. I'm a 52-year-old man. I can only know and understand so much. So there's every possibility that I'm going to hit a button on my computer. I'm going to disconnect myself, totally knock the internet off in my whole neighborhood. I don't know, turn the microphone off, knock my computer off this stand. I don't know. It could happen. I just want to let you know ahead of time, if I lose connectivity, it's not going to be y'all's fault. It'll no doubt be something on my end. Good news is I have the link. I can put it back and get back with you in a matter of seconds. I just know that if I don't say that, I'll get disconnected. Y'all will wonder what happened. Now you know. Anyway, hopefully that will not take place, and we'll get the next hour together roughly, and then about half an hour worth of Q&A to talk about obviously some incredibly important issues and relate them to this wonderful conference that I'm really honored to be a part of this year. I want to start out by saying, that having been doing this work for 26 years around the country and 30 years overall as a racial justice activist, educator, et cetera, I can say without any fear of contradiction that this moment right now that we are in the last 9 months or so is really one of the most dramatic moments for racial justice movements, certainly in my personal experience, but I would say even in the history of the country. We are right now still in the midst of the largest racial justice uprising in America's history, dating back to the killing of George Floyd last Memorial Day weekend in Minneapolis. And now 9 months later, we have had approximately 10,000 demonstrations, rallies, protests, or other public events specifically geared toward addressing issues of racial justice in communities large and small all around the country. Those events have involved at this point something like 23, maybe 25 million unique individuals, which far and away makes it the largest uprising that the country has seen. Far more people, both numerically and as a percentage of the overall population, who have participated in this last 9 months of activism and racial justice organizing than were involved in the civil rights struggle, for instance. So it's certainly a very dramatic moment. It's dramatic, obviously, because of the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, and others at the hands of police, or in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, at the hands of vigilantes in Georgia. But it's also a moment for this racial justice uprising because of the coronavirus pandemic that we are still in as we gather, here today. We're now a year into this, and this is not just a public health emergency. It is that, obviously, but it's also a racial justice emergency, because we know that Black folks, Indigenous folks, and Latinx folks have mortality rates, death rates that are approximately 2.5 times to 3.5 times higher than the mortality and death rates for white folks. It's bad enough for white folks, right? We have 450,000 plus individuals who have died so far. About 250,000 of those are white. The other 200,000 or so are people of color, roughly around there. So the majority of deaths are still white folks, but disproportionately, it's Black and brown folks who have suffered the most from this pandemic. So that too is a racial justice issue. And I have to tell you that I think the reason that we're in the middle of this racial justice uprising, and why it's so important for us to talk about this right now, is because both the police misconduct issue and this larger public health issue happened at roughly the same time. Because after all, after the killing of George Floyd, I remember a lot of people asking, particularly Black and brown folks asking, well, why are all these white folks suddenly paying attention to racial injustice, right? Like, this is not really a new problem. Why is it that they're just now waking up to this? In fact, the killing of George Floyd on camera wasn't the first time that we had seen that movie, literally, right? We had seen Eric Garner choked out on the streets of Staten Island a few years before that, and it didn't lead to this level of uprising. We had seen Tamir Rice shot to death by police in a Cleveland Park 12-year-old child playing with a toy gun. It didn't lead to this level of uprising, right? We saw, Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge killed on camera a few years before, and it didn't lead to this level of uprising. The aftermath of Philando Castile, killed also in the Twin Cities on Facebook Live, and that didn't lead to this level of uprising. We saw John Crawford in Beaver Creek, Ohio, outside of Dayton, shot on a Walmart security camera, also unarmed and unthreatening, but killed by police. And that didn't lead to this level of uprising. So the question became, why now, right? Why is it that all of a sudden we have 23, 24, 25 million people, including millions of white Americans, suddenly waking up to what Black and brown folks have been trying to tell us literally for 400 years and multiple generations? And I would suggest that part of the reason why the nation's attention, including white folks' attention, has been riveted to this is because of the coronavirus moment. The very fact that we are experiencing life quite a bit differently right now, for the past year, more sequestered, cloistered than normal. The normal routine of our daily lives quite different, right? We're not going about the normal routine. We're experiencing sort of intermittent lockdowns. We're at home much more. There's a lot more quiet, not as much background noise, not as much of the daily routine. And as a result of that, as a result of having that relative quiet, that relative isolation, the vast majority of Americans are able to actually see some things that maybe they missed, right? Or chose not to see in the past. We're able to hear some things that maybe we didn't hear before because we were busy hitting that snooze button on the alarm clock that's been going off for hundreds of years, right? Or we were able to feel some things that we had learned to suppress and not feel. And so all of a sudden, right, we have this attention being paid to things that Black and brown folks have been trying to get white Americans to pay attention to for a very long time. On the one hand, it's a wonderful development that even in the midst of tragedy and crisis, we can now begin to focus. So that's good in the sense that we're now paying some attention. Of course, the bad thing is that it took that level of crisis and awfulness to get us to pay attention. And the bigger problem is, how do we maintain that commitment over the long term, right? How do we actually take that momentary focus that we've had for the last 9 or 10 months and actually turn that into a long-term expansion of movement activity? Because when we get on the other side of coronavirus, which, I mean, I hear that's going to happen here any day, right? Supposedly, we're going to get on the other side of it. When we do, right, and then we get back to the normal routine of going to work the way we did and going to school the way we did and hanging out the way we did, are we still going to be focused, or is our attention going to be taken away from it now, right? Are we going to turn away again? Are we going to hit the snooze button again and go back to sleep? Because that's what we normally do. So it's an open question, right? Once the immediate crisis passes, how do we maintain a commitment? And that's what I want to talk to you about today, right? How do we actually, in the long term, maintain a commitment to racial justice? And what does this movement mean for higher educational institutions like yours? And specifically, what does it mean for students and faculty and administrators and folks who are at colleges like yours and other rural and semi-rural spaces, right? Because it's one thing to talk about what this means for a college. It's right in the middle of a city where these issues are always on the front page and always being talked about, right? It's quite another to talk about what this means for folks in smaller towns and in rural and semi-rural areas. And so I want to really sort of drill down into that today and talk a little bit about what that means and why it's important, not only at the obvious places where it's always been an issue, but why it's important for you all as well. I remember many years ago, it might have been the first time that I went to sort of the eastern side of either Oregon or Washington. I remember I was I can't remember where I was. I know it was a very small town, and I was speaking at a school. It was overwhelmingly white institution, very much like your own, and the community that was overwhelmingly white. And I remember, I think a well-meaning person, I'm fairly confident they meant well, but sometimes good intentions don't translate, right? This really well-intended person said something to me along the lines of, I mean, we don't really have a race problem here because there really aren't any Black people or brown people around, right? There just aren't any people of color around here. Well, first of all, of course there were, right? So that wasn't an accurate perception. But the problem with the statement was that sort of the implicit assumption of that statement, the subtext, was that, well, as long as there are no people of color around, there's no problem. But actually, that may be the problem, right? That may actually be your race problem. The fact that the community is overwhelmingly white and there aren't very many people of color, and you actually have the luxury of thinking there aren't any, even when there are, albeit, maybe a small percentage, that may be your problem. After all, it's not a coincidence that certain parts of Oregon, certain parts of Washington State, certain parts of the country from coast to coast look the way that they look. That doesn't just happen. I think sometimes we get the impression that, shit just happens and we have no idea how, right? We have no idea how that town came to be so white. My gosh, what's that about? Or how that college came to look the way that it did. And we don't understand why other communities are disproportionately black and brown. It's like people it's just random, it's just coincidence. Well, I guess the black folks just decided to all live here. And I guess the Latinx folks all decided to live here. And it's just, half the indigenous people in the country decided to live on these reservations. Okay, we get that, right? As opposed to understanding that there were systemic forces that push certain people into certain spaces and then kept them from being in other spaces. I mean, in Oregon, Oregon made it very clear that black folks were to leave the territory. I mean, it wasn't really an option for black folks to stick around at one point. And of course, we know the mistreatment of indigenous peoples all throughout the Northwest, right? And the Pacific Northwest and really all of the country. So where people live, where they don't live, where they go to school, where they don't go to school, none of this is the result of random chance. And so to believe that we don't have a race problem when certain people aren't around ignores that they're not being around is the problem, right? And so you have to talk about that. It's not a coincidence. It's also important for institutions like your own to talk about this because, after all, even if you grow up in an area where you are, let's say, white in a mostly white community, there's a really good chance that at some point you're going to leave and you're going to go somewhere else. And so the question is, are you prepared to interact with that space that's not like the one you're in? I mean, I think you need these skills even if you stay there, because there are going to be people who come from different backgrounds, different racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds than your own, with whom you need to be able to interact constructively. But whether you leave or whether you go, you're going to need those. You're going to need those skills. The world is bigger than the place where you grow up. And unless all students, both of color and white folks, are prepared to engage in that broader world, then your own communities and you yourself are all going to suffer. There is a real danger in indulging the privilege of obliviousness. And I know sometimes we use the term privilege and people get very defensive, particularly if you put the word white in front of it. So if I say that there's a thing called white privilege, the sort of instinctual response on the part of most white folks is say, not me, because we're thinking privilege is being rich. And that is a form of privilege. Class privilege is about being wealthy, and most of us are not. I certainly didn't grow up wealthy. I grew up in an 850 square foot apartment that I lived in from the time I was 3 days old to the day I went out the door to college. So didn't grow up with money, didn't grow up with property or wealth. But we're not talking about just that, right? We're not just talking about money. We're talking about the privileges that come from a number of different identities, like for able-bodied people, having privilege relative to those with disabilities. It's just the privilege of not having to sweat some stuff today, right? Not having to sweat how I'm going to get from one side of the campus to the other in the time allotted between classes, or, how I'm going to navigate my workspace, right? Because as an able-bodied person, institutions and schedules were made for people like me. Right? They're usually made by people like me, for people like me. So I just don't have to think about some stuff. I have the privilege of being oblivious to the lived experiences of people who face obstacles and barriers on the basis of disability and who face ableism and discrimination on that basis. Doesn't make me a bad person, right? Doesn't make me a horrible, unfeeling, uncaring person. It just means that I have the luxury of being oblivious. The problem is when you have the luxury of being oblivious, not only will you often step on other people's toes who don't have that luxury, but you will also not really be prepared for the world as it is, even for yourself. So it's not only that you'll hurt others by not having a clue and being sort of unaware of the way you go through the world, but ultimately you may very well also do damage to yourself, to your own experiences, to your own opportunities. And so I really want to talk about that. And I want to explore, and then we can talk about this more during the Q&A, how the experiences of people in rural and semi-rural communities, including white folks who predominate in those spaces, how your experiences and those people's experiences are deeply connected to the struggles of peoples of color, of Black and brown peoples, right? The way that racial inequity, which peoples of color experience, class inequity, which working class people of all races experience, and even geographic inequity between large metropolitan areas and cities on the one hand and rural and semi-rural areas on the other, how those things are connected, because we oftentimes skip over that. And when we skip over it, what we do is we give the impression to white folks that this isn't our issue, right? That racism is a Black or brown issue. Let them deal with it. Let them do all the hard work, right? And we give the impression that it's not connected to our experience, so that we shouldn't really sweat it. We really shouldn't worry about it. You know, we'll deal with our stuff over here and they deal with their stuff over here, as opposed to understanding that what peoples of color, what Black and brown folks are struggling with is deeply connected to some of the things that we as white folks also struggle with, especially in communities like the one where you are located. So first, in order to really explore that, I want to look at the educational system, since we're talking about it in the context of higher ed. And I want to briefly explore the way that racial inequity, class inequity, and even geographic and regional inequity is baked into the educational system. And if we want to fix any of those, we have to fix all of them. And if we want to fix any of those, we have to understand how we got the system that we currently have. If you don't understand the system you're operating in, you can't adequately fix it. You don't even know what the machinery is that you're tinkering with. So let's talk a little bit about that. How did we get such profoundly unequal educational systems in our country? Not just racial, right? Not just racial, but economic as well. How do we end up with a higher education system that's so incredibly unaffordable for so many millions of people, not just Black and brown folk, but a lot of working class and struggling white folks too, who are going deeply into debt in order to afford higher education, and then end up spending 10, 15, 20 years of their lives trying to pay off that debt? How does that happen? And why do we end up with that system? A lot of other countries that we like to compare ourselves with don't have such incredibly expensive and unequal systems on the basis of race, on the basis of class, or any other category, right? They make the financing much more affordable, right? But in this country, we have a very different kind of system. Why is that? Where did that come from? Well, if you want to understand that, you have to start by going back to the beginning of the formation of the American educational system to understand what the architects of that system intended as they sketched out the blueprint for that system, if you will. And the best place to start is with Thomas Jefferson. Now, before Thomas Jefferson was our president and, you know, one of the founders of the country, right? He was also an educational thinker and theorist. He was somebody whose views on education and schooling were very well respected in his day. He was someone that folks turned to for insight about the proper way to develop a school system. And one of his most famous writings, other than the Declaration of Independence, right? One of his most famous writings was this thing called Notes on the State of Virginia. And in his treatise known as Notes on the State of Virginia, he talked about schooling in the new nation. And what he said, and this is really important because it gives you a sense of why our architecture of schooling became what it became and why it's still that thing that produces inequality. What he said was this. He said, what we need in the new nation is, 5 or 6 years of compulsory mandatory education. Now, keep in mind, he was only talking about school for white boys. He wasn't even talking about white girls or women, and he certainly wasn't talking about Black folk and indigenous people. He had no interest in them receiving formal education whatsoever. He was really just talking about white boys. But even for them, what he was saying was just 5 or 6 years of school. That's all we need. I guess in the 1780s, that was, a big deal. 5 or 6 years of school. And here's why. This is what he said. He said, we need that so that we can rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. Okay. These are his words. Rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. Now, what he's just said is most of y'all are trash. And remember, he's just talking about white guys, right? He doesn't even think much of most white men, let alone black and brown folk, let alone women of any color. He's just saying, white boys, most of y'all are rubbish, most of y'all are garbage. But if we let you have like 6 years of school, then we can figure out like the handful of y'all that are bright enough to come run stuff with the rest of us, right? Handful of us going to run stuff. The rest of y'all going to do hard work. So what Thomas Jefferson was saying is the purpose of education is inequality, not equality, inequality. And it's important to note that, right? Because a lot of times I talk to teachers, K-12 or college, doesn't matter. And you ask them like, why'd you become a teacher? Why did you want to get into education? It wasn't for the money, right? It wasn't for the fame or the prestige or the pat on the back or the high regard of the public, because we know educators are not revered the way they ought to be. They're certainly not paid the way they ought to be. So it wasn't for that. Why'd you do it? And a lot of times the answer you'll get will be, well, because education is the great equalizer. Well, no, it's not. Thomas Jefferson just told you that's not the point. Y'all not paying attention. Education is not equalizing anything. It was never intended to do that. So if I look at the data right now in 2021, which tells me that even Black folks with a college degree are almost twice as likely as white folks with a degree to be unemployed, even if they had the same major, right? What does that tell me? Education is not equalizing. Latinx folks with a degree, 50% more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. Indigenous people with a degree, 2/3 more likely than similar whites to be unemployed. Asian Americans with a degree, 20% more likely than comparable whites to be unemployed. Education is not an equalizer, and that's not an accident. That's not like, oh, the system's failing. No, Thomas Jefferson told you that was the point, y'all. The point was inequality, raking geniuses from the rubbish. So education is not for everybody. We never meant it to be. That's important. If you don't understand the basis, the foundation of the educational system that you're part of, how in the hell are you going to fix it, right? It's like going to a sausage factory and standing at the end of the conveyor belt and you're like, damn, where are my chicken nuggets? Man, I really wanted some chicken nuggets. It's a sausage factory, fool. Read the sign. Like, just walk outside, look at the building. It says sausage factory right there in big ass letters, and you're waiting for chicken. You're not going to get chicken out of a sausage factory. Expect sausage. That's why it was created. So if Thomas Jefferson tells you expect inequality, don't be surprised when we end up with inequality. Now, fast forward, because I know some folks would say, yeah, but that was a long time ago, man. That was 1780s or whatever. Okay, so let's move forward. Early 1900s, Woodrow Wilson, who also, of course, became president. Before he was president, he was the president at Princeton University, right? And he was also somebody that was really well regarded as an educational thinker, very highly thought of, just like Jefferson had been when it came to educational theories and the proper way to do schooling. And here's what Wilson said when asked. He said, well, what we need is we need one group of people to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education. That was the term they used to use for college. It doesn't mean liberal like liberal or conservative, right? That's the phrase they used to use back in the day. So he said, we need one group to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education. But what he said is we need another group, a much larger group by necessity, he said, in this and every other society, to forego that privilege of a liberal education and instead prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks, right? In other words, Woodrow Wilson was saying, same thing Jefferson was saying, most of y'all just need to lift heavy stuff because we're too good for it. We're the masters of the universe, and we're going to let some of y'all go to college, figure out which ones of y'all can come and run stuff with us, and the rest of y'all are going to sweat because we don't sweat. We're too special to sweat. We don't do hard work. We let y'all do the hard work. So he was basically saying the same thing Jefferson was saying. The purpose of school is not equalization. It's not to spread opportunity to everybody. And again, Wilson wasn't even thinking about Black and brown people, right? Wilson was a vicious racist. He didn't intend for Black folks to get schooled. He didn't intend for brown folks to get schooled. I'm pretty sure he wasn't thinking about women either. He's just talking about white folks and especially white men. And even then, he's saying most of y'all white men don't count for anything either. We don't love you. We don't care about you. And we don't expect you to actually be running anything. We expect you to be sweating and toiling and laboring away for our benefit forever, right? So he's saying inequality is built into this thing. for everybody, race, class, gender, all of it. It's not accidental. That's really important, right? Because you think about it like an app on a phone. Like every morning I wake up and I turn my phone on and I get, updates at the app store will say, oh, you got updates on this app. And you look at what the update is and it's like, oh, there was a bug in the app or a glitch. And, here's a patch, right? This is the update's going to fix the bug. Man, it's not like that. Inequality is not a bug. Inequality is not a glitch in the app. Inequality is the app, right? Like it's a feature. It was built in. There's no patch coming. There's no fix coming. Like that was the whole point, right? And so if you want to create equity, race, gender, class, or any other kind, you have to literally rebuild the machinery. You have to get a new app. You can't just tinker around and fix the old one because that software that it's running on, or maybe the hardware that it's running on, is intended to produce a certain outcome. Jefferson told you, Wilson told you. Let's fast forward again, because some folks would still say, Tim, you're being cynical. That was a long time ago. Wilson said that in the early 1900s. It's been 100+ years. Surely things have changed. Well, let's see. So let's come up to 2001. Now we're talking 20 years ago. Not that long ago, right? Modern era. And I'm watching a Sunday talk show one day, and George W. Bush has just become president, and they've just passed later that year, 2001, I guess it was. Yeah, it was the show was either late 01 or early 02. But one of the first things that happens in that administration is they pass an educational reform bill called No Child Left Behind, right? And right after that bill passes, they bring on to one of the Sunday talk shows, William Bennett. Now, this is a guy that during the Reagan administration in the 80s, he was the Secretary of Education. He was also the drug czar. He didn't do either one of these jobs real well, but he had both of them. He was the education secretary, and until the last administration, he had been the worst education secretary in the history of education secretaries, but clearly records are made to be broken. So now he's holding tight at number 2. But Bill Bennett was on the Sunday talk show, and they're asking him, after this new bill has been passed, Secretary Bennett, what's the biggest problem facing American education today? And that's a big question, right? Like that's a really huge kind of question. Like if you asked me that question on national television, I would probably be like, man, can we take a commercial break and give me like 2 minutes to think about it? Because I don't want to screw that one up. Like that's a big one. I don't want to mess that up in front of 10 million people. How many people are watching this? Bill Bennett didn't need 2 minutes, didn't need a commercial break, didn't need 20 seconds, didn't even need to take a sip of water, catch his breath. He had the answer on the tip of his tongue. Remember the question, what's the biggest problem facing American education today? And Bill Bennett says, former Secretary of Education, says, well, the biggest problem is too many people are going to college. Interesting. Notice what he didn't say. He didn't add to that sentence by saying too many people are going to college who can't afford it because it's too damn expensive. That would have been a good answer, right? He didn't say too many people are going to college that aren't adequately prepared because we haven't provided sufficient K-12 resources in their K-12 schools. That would have been a pretty decent answer. No, there was no additional part of that sentence. There was no comma, no dash, no semicolon. Man, he put a period at the end of it and just said too many people are going, period. Now, who is he talking about? Ask yourself, who is he talking about when he says too many people are going to college? Well, he doesn't say, but let's sort of think it through, right? Who is he not talking about? I think we can figure that one out, right? I'll tell you who he's not talking about. He's not talking about the rich and mediocre children of rich and mediocre parents who have been the children of like 5 generations of wealthy mediocrity. And I'm telling you, I've met a lot of really rich and mediocre people. Right? You can go to any prep school on the East Coast. You can go to Groton, Choate, Phillips, Exeter. You can go to any prep school on the West Coast, any school anywhere where elite people go. And I assure you, there are C students there. And there are D students there. And there are students that are graduating last in their class, barely graduating at all. And yet, oddly enough, nobody ever comes to these kids of wealth and privilege and power and says, I know you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or take over daddy's business, but I mean, your grades aren't really good. Maybe you should consider a career in fast food. Right? Nobody ever does that. Nobody ever questions that they want to go to college. Nobody ever questions when they want to go to law school or med school or business school or take over daddy's business. The assumption is, of course, you're going to go to college. So when Bill Bennett says the biggest problem in American schooling is that too many people are going, he ain't talking about those people. He doesn't mind if rich, mediocre people go to college. So who's he talking about? See, he's talking about other folks. the folks that maybe 20 years ago wouldn't have been going, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, 100 years ago, wouldn't have been going, because those rich, mediocre people have always been going, and he's never complained. So you know it's not them. The only people that are going now that wouldn't have been going before are going to be what? Folks of color and working class people of all colors, right? So when he says too many people are going, and that's the biggest problem, not funding, not affordability, not the quality of instruction, not the financial resources made available to prepare people adequately for college. When he just says too many y'all are going, he is repeating what Thomas Jefferson was saying and what Woodrow Wilson was saying. He's saying it a little differently, but it's the same mentality. Why are all these people going to college? Don't they know they need to lift heavy things for us? They need to be doing the sweaty, difficult work that we're too damn special to do. It's the mentality of the slave owner, right? Because what was the mentality of the slave owner? The mentality of the slave owner was, hey man, if they all learn to read, who is going to pick this cotton, right? And in the modern era, that mentality says, well, if they all go to college, like, who's going to pick this fruit in the fields, right? If they all go to college, who's going to change the bedpans at the hospital? If they all go to college, who's gonna change the sheets at the hotels, right? Who's gonna do that work? Who's gonna pick up my garbage every Wednesday in my alley behind my house? If they all go to college, see, they're gonna think they're too good for that, right? And so what Bill Bennett was saying is what Woodrow Wilson was saying, is what Thomas Jefferson was saying. Education is deliberately about producing inequality. And notice that's not just something that's affecting Black and brown peoples, right? That's not just racial inequality, that's economic inequality, meaning working class white folks end up screwed by that same system, right? But how often do working class white folks think of themselves as being in that boat with Black and brown people? Almost never. They're encouraged to believe that they're not in that same boat. Now, they're not experiencing it exactly the same. I would argue Black and brown folks are the targets of white supremacy in ways that make it far worse. But what I'm suggesting is working class white folks are still being screwed by a mentality that says some folks are worth more than others. It's not just that white life matters more than Black and brown life. We've demonstrated that consistently for 400 years. What we're also saying is elite life matters more than your working class ass, right? Rich life matters more than poor, more than working class, more than middle class, right? And our school system was set up with that mentality in mind. It's also geographic, because what was Jefferson and what was Wilson talking about, and what is even Bill Bennett talking about? They're talking about an educational system where all the power resides, you know, with East Coast elites. That's what Wilson was talking about for sure. At Princeton, come on, we know what Princeton was at the time he was president. That was a finishing school for rich East Coast Protestant men, is essentially what that was. The whole concept of higher education was Ivy League schools and a handful of other East Coast schools, and you had Stanford and a handful of elite schools on the West Coast, but the idea, maybe the University of Chicago in between, but it was this notion that college was just this place where powerful people send their powerful children to become powerful adults and keep running stuff the way it's always been. So if you live in a rural area, I don't care if it's Oregon, I don't care if it's Tennessee, which is where I live, doesn't matter, it could be Nebraska, doesn't matter. If you're not up here, if you're not in Connecticut and you're not in, you know, Pennsylvania, you're not in New York, you're not in Boston, or maybe out in, you know, the Bay Area and now Silicon Valley, perhaps. If you're not in those areas, right, then we don't really care about your opportunities. We don't really care about ensuring that you can go to college, because I mean, you're supposed to be, you're the rubbish that Jefferson was talking about, right? You're the folks who are supposed to forego the privilege of a quote unquote liberal or college education and perform certain difficult manual tasks, right? So racial inequity, class inequity, geographic disparity, all of that's connected, meaning if I'm white and I'm living in rural Oregon, I got to care about Black and brown life, because if I don't care about Black and brown life, I'm endorsing a system that also doesn't care about mine, right? I'm endorsing a system that doesn't really give a damn about me either. I'm the collateral damage of that system. I may not have been the intended target, but I'm certainly the collateral damage of it. Maybe if I'd cared more about racial inequity, I could have joined with Black and brown folks to fix that K-12 system, not only for their benefit, but for mine and my children as well, right? But it's not just education. It's also true with the larger economic struggles of rural areas and the people, including white folks who live in them, right? So we live in a country with profound racial disparity. Obviously, I've already talked a little bit about that and about the fact that even peoples of color who get college degrees far more likely to be unemployed. We know also when it comes to wealth and assets that the typical white family in America has about 12 times the net worth of the typical Black family, about 8 to 10 times the net worth of the typical Latinx family. And so we know these disparities are vast. If you just look at financial assets and take away like housing value, which is the main source of wealth for most people, if you take that out of the equation, because it's hard to just liquidate your house and sell it, right? You can't just turn around and sell your house real quick if you need money. If you just look at financial assets, real estate investments, stocks and bonds, you know, things like that, the gap is more like 400 to 1 in favor of white folks. So for every dollar Black and brown folks have, white folks have like $400 worth of financial wealth. We know that piece is huge, that level of racial disparity. But we also have vast levels of economic disparity that immiserate the vast majority of people, right? 0.1% of the American population owns a disproportionate amount of the wealth, right? Overwhelmingly, you have about 30 people in this country that own like as much wealth as the bottom 95% or something along those lines, bottom 90%, I should say. 30 something people, right, that have as much wealth as the bottom 90% of people combined. That means that the vast majority of white folks are being left out of that as well, including obviously the vast majority of Black and brown folks. And we also have massive geographic disparity. We have regions, including rural and semi-rural areas, that are hurting a lot right now. And unfortunately, if you're given a reason to believe that you're hurting that isn't correct, then you can't fix the problem. And so right now, what we tell people in small towns and rural areas, well, you're hurting because, you know, the people in the city are getting all the money. And that's often code for Black and brown people, right? It's often code for their getting the benefits, and you're the forgotten majority. You're the heartbeat of America. You're the backbone of America. Rural, working class folks who live and work on farms and live in small towns, and you're being forgotten, right? That's the reactionary right-wing sort of mentality that brings certain people to power on the basis of grievance and white resentment, right? This idea that you're hurting because they're benefiting. But oddly enough, the reality is exactly the opposite of that. The reason that people in those rural and semi-rural areas are hurting is not because the people in cities, especially Black and brown folks, are benefiting. It's because they're hurting too. Their pain and your pain is actually linked, but a lot of times white folks in rural areas don't see that. Now, what do I mean when I say that that pain is linked? Well, let's think about this. For the last 50 plus years, actually, no, let's go back further than that. Let's go back to the period around the 1930s and 1940s. Great Depression begins in October of 29, of course, and all throughout the 30s, the country is in this economic hole. Now, they come out of this hole in large part because of major government intervention in the economy, right? Massive jobs programs, construction programs, infrastructure, building bridges and buildings and roads and all kinds of things to put people back to work. Social Security is also created at that time. The Federal Housing Administration is created and starts to offer low interest loans. Lots of government intervention in the economy. Interestingly, most of those programs that were created really pretty much only for the benefit of white people, right? It's sort of thought of as this program for working class people, but Black folks and brown folks were routinely excluded from those things, weren't even able to get in on a lot of those things. Social Security, for instance, the ability to have this government financed retirement program for the first 20 years from 35 to like 55. Most Black folks were excluded from it because there was a provision in the Social Security law that said if you worked as an agricultural laborer, which a large number of Black folks did in the South at that time, working as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, you weren't covered. Right. And if you worked as a domestic worker in someone else's house, right, cleaning, or taking care of their children or whatnot, you also weren't eligible. So like 85% of Black people were written out of one of the biggest government programs ever. And then the FHA loan program for housing, very similar. Black and brown folks almost entirely excluded from that. A lot of the jobs programs, they weren't excluded, but the law said that, your entitlement to those programs could be overridden by the right of the employer to discriminate. So they could discriminate against you in college admission, and they did. They could discriminate against you in using your benefits to get a private sector job, and they did. Very much the way that when the Homestead Act had been passed in the 1860s, that opened up so much of the West to land speculation and development, ranching and farming, that also 240 million acres of land was given out to white folks, and black and brown folks pretty much entirely excluded from that. So you had this massive government intervention, and it saved a lot of white people, right? It saved a lot of white rural folks. It brought electricity to their communities that hadn't existed before. It put money into white rural schools. It put money into white rural infrastructure. It provided the foundation for what became the white middle class. And in those days, the idea of government helping people in need was a very popular thing, as long as the people in need were seen as white, right? And so as long as those programs were routinely excluding anyone who wasn't white, they were very popular. Nobody was complaining about them, right? Nobody was saying, oh, we need to cut government spending, because government spending makes you lazy. Everybody was behind that because it was helping them. Right? It was saving their farm. It was helping their little one-stop light town. It was benefiting, it was helping to create their colleges and their community colleges and putting money into into job creation and infrastructure development. But then something happened, right? Beginning in the 1960s, as the civil rights movement begins to gain strength, and we begin to open up opportunity to people who had been excluded, including access to some of those programs that were, what we call welfare programs, but income support programs, food assistance, housing assistance, things that had been available to whites already for 30 years, but not so much to black and brown folks. Once those programs could no longer be racially exclusive because the laws changed and, the civil rights movement pushed for changes in those things, all of a sudden you start to see this backlash against any effort to help people in need, right? All of a sudden it's like, oh no, wait a minute now, government spending to help poor people and working class struggling people, that makes them dependent on government. They just need to get out and get a job. Stop coddling them, right? They made bad decisions. That's why they're poor. That's why they're struggling. It was a racialized notion of poverty and struggle, right? If we conceive of those people as taking advantage, then we can justify cutting all these programs. Well, here's the problem. Once you justify cutting those programs and reducing government help for housing, reducing government help for income support in recessions, reducing support for education, reducing support for anything in the public sphere, because you associate public with black and brown people. You associate public housing with them, public transportation with them, public schools with them, any kind of public effort, government intervention to help as being taking from some who we now think of as white and giving to them who we think of as black and brown, then all of a sudden this mentality gets sedimented in the society where we don't want to help folks anymore. So all of that help that we gave without any question for 30 years, now all of a sudden it's like, no, we can't do that. Here's the problem. You still got millions of white folks in need, right? You still got white folks who are experiencing struggle, who don't have food security, who don't have affordable health care, right? Who don't have access to paid leave or a decent wage or, good enough educational facilities or good enough housing. But because we've now stigmatized doing anything about that, because we have created this image that government help is for those people. Once you create that stigma, then all those white folks that need help, not going to get help. And all those white communities that need help are not going to get help. We didn't think twice in the 30s about putting money into rural areas to help farmers. During the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, where you had major drought and you had farm families that couldn't feed themselves, let alone, serve as the breadbasket of the world, as rural areas and farming areas are called, we had no problem with putting money into those communities. But once you create the mentality that says we need to cut government spending, we need to cut taxes, right? Because these people are taking advantage, that means less for everybody. That just doesn't hurt black folks and brown folks. That might be the people that they were wanting to hurt, but then it ends up hurting working class white people as well, and the communities where they live, meaning that everybody suffers. And there was a study several years ago at Harvard, which interestingly found that when you're trying to figure out why does America have such an inadequate safety net, right? Such a Swiss cheese kind of safety net for people that are struggling compared to other countries. Because when you compare us to, other Western industrialized nations that we like to compare ourselves to, you'll find that those other countries do a lot more for people in need, right? Across the board, education, income support, housing, healthcare, all of it. So what is it that separates us? Why do we do so much less? And they looked at all the different reasons and they ran all these statistical regressions to try to figure out what were the key features that explain that. And what they found was that the single biggest factor in determining whether people support those kinds of programs for people in need is whether they believe Black people will abuse those programs. Right? So if white folks are thinking Black people will abuse any government program, then that means they don't want those government programs to exist for anybody. Right? And the irony is that means that they and people that they know in their own damn families and neighbors and other white folks, they don't get those things when they need them either. Right? We're willing to cut off our nose to spite our face just to make a point that we don't want other people taking advantage. And as a result, we all end up having less. Right? It's ironic. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine who is a professor. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, and there's a Vanderbilt University. It's like 5 minutes from where I live. And there's a professor over there, guy by the name of Jonathan Metzl, friend of mine, who wrote a book called Dying of Whiteness. And in that book, he went and he talked to white folks. He talked to some here in Tennessee, went to Kansas, went to Missouri, and talked to white folks about a number of different issues, including healthcare, guns, education, lots of stuff. And he was trying to figure out why white folks sometimes, voice support for policies or do things that actually harm them, right? That aren't really in their best interest. And so here in Tennessee, he went and he talked to some white men who are just outside of Nashville in a suburban bedroom community about 20 minutes from here. He was talking to these low-income white guys, working class white guys, low income, who lived actually in subsidized housing. Section 8 voucher housing. But I think the whole community was pretty much white folks. And he's talking to this white guy, like 42, 43 years old. This guy is sick. He has some kind of liver disease brought on probably from years of heavy drinking. And Jonathan is talking to him about healthcare. And this guy doesn't have any health insurance. And Jonathan says to him, it's a shame if you lived in Kentucky, which is just right above where we are, you could get on a really good state version of Obamacare, because Kentucky had expanded Obamacare or expanded Medicaid under Obamacare to cover more people. They had done a really good job. They ended up going back on that a couple of years later when they got a new governor. But at the time, they had done a really good thing. And Tennessee hadn't done that. We had not expanded Medicaid to cover people like this guy. So as a result, he was falling through the cracks. And so Jonathan says, man, if you just lived in Kentucky, you'd be set. And this guy says, it doesn't matter. I wouldn't want to be on Obamacare anyway. And he says, well, why not? And he goes, I'd rather die than be on Obamacare, because that's for welfare cheats and illegal immigrants. His words, not mine, right? He said he'd rather die than be on that program, even though he didn't have any health insurance. He'd rather die than be on a program that he thinks those people are benefiting from. That dude is dead now, by the way. Dead. And apparently was okay with that, because he'd rather do that than maybe move to Kentucky or fight for better healthcare in Tennessee, right? He's just like, I don't want to be associated with that. You see what I'm saying? Right? In other words, this mentality that we've allowed to exist that looks down on people of color and tries to sort of lecture them and damage them and cut programs that we think they benefit from, it ends up getting us too. We see it with the opioid crisis in this country, right? You look around and you see disproportionate opioid overdoses in where? In white communities that are rural and semi-rural small towns. Now, I don't want to suggest that it's only there, because there's also an opioid crisis in Black and brown communities and in urban areas. But disproportionately, when you look at the excess deaths from opiates in the last 15 to 20 years, there's no question that you see a disproportionate amount of that in smaller towns and rural areas. Why? Why is that happening? Well, in part, I would suggest, I would say there are two things, right? Number one is that for the last 40 years or so, really probably more than that, closer to 50 years, we have been thinking of drug and treating drugs, thinking of and treating drug addiction and drug use as what? A crime problem and a moral failing, not as a health problem. Right. And so you had all these folks that were like 3 strikes and you're out, war on drugs, lock their ass up. But who were they? Who were the ones whose asses were going to be locked up? Well, they were perceived as black and brown, right? War on drugs was about getting those people on that side of town or in that area, in that big city. Let's lock their ass up because they're just criminals and gangbangers and all this other stuff. So let's put them in prison, right? Because they're morally repellent because they're using drugs or selling drugs. And so we didn't want to do rehab. We didn't want to put money into rehabilitation. We didn't want to put money into drug treatment. We didn't want to put money into drug education. To hell with that. Just lock them up. And the same people who demanded that of their politicians, the same people that voted for politicians for whom that was the proper response, those same people are the one whose little cousin Jimmy John over here has got a fentanyl addiction or an oxy addiction or a heroin habit. And they're like, well, where's the rehab? Well, I don't know, fool. Maybe you shouldn't have voted for people who decided to put everybody with a drug problem behind bars. Maybe you should have put the money into rehab, but you didn't do that because it was just those people who were hurting. So you didn't care because Black lives didn't matter. See, brown lives didn't matter. You didn't care. So to hell with them, lock them up. And now little Jimmy down there at the trailer has got a problem and you don't have any resources. Oh, you're kidding. I wonder if we could have told this. Somebody could have just told you that that was going to happen 40 years ago. Well, some folks did. Black and brown folks said it and they were just like, to hell with it. We don't care. Right. So we have an opioid drug problem in those spaces because we didn't take care of business and have rehab and treatment on the front end when it was disproportionately Black and brown folks during the crack epidemic or during the 1970s. We had a heroin epidemic in the 70s in urban areas too that was disproportionately Black and brown. And we didn't do anything because it was like, oh, their lives don't matter as much. See, we didn't take care of business then. And then we wonder why we can't take care of it now. See, the fates are linked. When you don't deal with racial inequity over here, it comes back to bite you on the ass. There's another problem that explains the opioid situation, right? Think about, and this a couple of years ago, there was this research came out of Princeton that was looking at what they call deaths of despair, right? It was looking at white folks who were middle-aged, working class, non-college educated, often in rural areas, who had been experiencing a disproportionate amount of these excess deaths of despair, they called them. And these deaths were like not normal causes, right? It wasn't just like having a heart attack. It was opioid overdose deaths. It was cirrhosis of the liver, which is usually brought on by, heavy drinking, or it was suicide, right? And just in those 3 categories, there were like an additional 500,000 deaths, 500,000 excess deaths above what would have been expected and what would have been normal among white, non-college educated, middle-aged, working class white folks disproportionately in small towns and rural and semi-rural areas. And the researchers were trying to figure out why is this? And so they came up with this term deaths of despair. And they were saying, these are places where economic opportunity has been diminishing over the years, where the population is in decline because younger people are moving away. And so it's older people who are left and, the economy just can't be sustained on the backs of retirees or people whose median age is in their 40s because they're not reproducing as much. They don't have any kids, So you have these towns that are dying. You have industries that are dying. You got these folks that feel stuck and they're in their mid 50s and their lives aren't going anywhere or they're struggling. And so they're killing themselves either directly through suicide or indirectly through drugs or alcohol, right? And on the one hand, that makes sense. And there's some evidence for that. But see, there's also a problem, right? Because if you're just talking about people who are in pain or who are struggling to survive, well, yeah, those white folks that I'm talking about are hurting. But, if you look at any indicator of well-being, Black folks are hurting more. Brown folks are hurting more, like poverty, unemployment, education, housing value, wealth, all those things. Communities of color are in worse shape. And yet, they're not the ones who were disproportionately drinking and drugging and killing themselves. That's over here in these white working class communities. So it's not despair like in the abstract. When you say they're deaths of despair, it's not because those white folks are the ones in the most pain, but for some reason, they're the ones who are having the hardest time coping with their pain, which is fascinating, right? Because these folks over here hurting just as much, not killing themselves as readily. Why? See, I would contend that's also about privilege, because if I'm over here in this white space and you've told me all my life, which this country has, that all I have to do is work hard, play by the rules, keep my nose clean, stay out of trouble, and I'll be fine, and I'll be able to hand down something to my kids, and they'll be better off than me, and then their kids will be better off than them. If you tell me that for hundreds of years and tell my people that, and then all of a sudden I run up against a brick wall and I don't know how to deal with it, because I've never hit that wall before, and you told me I never would hit that wall. You told me that wall wasn't for me. That wall was for them. See, and they knew it, right? They've always known the wall was there. They've always been trying to figure out how to get over it, how to go around it, how to blow it up, dig under it, whatever. But over here, we were told that wall is not for you. Right? Those obstacles are not your obstacles. That pain is not your pain. And then when all of a sudden it is my pain, I don't have the coping mechanism and the skills to deal with it because you never told me that I would need to develop those. And so now I don't have the thick skin that I need, and I don't know how to put the pain, where to put it, and how to cope with this distance between what you promised me and what you delivered. See, Black folks and brown folks always knew it was a con. Right? Black and brown folks always knew it was a scam. They always knew that the promise was not worth the paper it was written on, but white people have had the luxury by and large of believing it. And then when we find out that it's like the Titanic, right? Like when the Titanic sank, what was that, 1913 or whatever, right? The Titanic goes down. And you know who the first people were who knew that that thing was going down? It was the people, the poorest people on that ship, at the bottom of that ship, right? Down in steerage. They knew because they hit the iceberg and like the water's coming in, right? And they're like, damn, this boat is going down. And they're screaming and yelling. They can't go upstairs. They're not allowed to go upstairs to where the fancier people, or even the middle, where the middle class people are. So they're yelling, they're screaming like, hey, y'all, like we're taking on water. Like, I think this ship might be about to sink. And everybody else is like, don't, what are you talking about? I hear somebody screaming, the boat's going to sink, but that's silly. We're up here eating lobster and listening to orchestra music and dancing and having a good old time. And the folks at the bottom are like, no, for real, like it's going to sink. Like we hit an iceberg, there's a lot of water, we got like an hour or whatever we got. And everybody else is just going about their damn business. And then what happens? The ship does in fact sink. And a lot of those people who were better off end up going down with it. Right? And the same is true with the society as a whole. When you ignore the pain that's happening over here, or you think to yourself, well, that's theirs and I don't have to worry about it because it won't ever spread to me, then it does. And you're not ready for it. So what I'm saying is the pain that white folks experience in an economy that, you know, really only serves the people at the top and was only meant to serve them. The pain that white folks experience, some working class white folks and rural folks in an educational system that really wasn't set up for them, was set up to serve elites, you know, that pain is not because Black and brown folks are taking something from you. It's because they're hurting too, right? They're hurting too. They may be hurting differently. They may be more directly impacted, but indirectly, those white folks are also hurting because that pain doesn't stay localized. It metastasizes like cancer throughout the economy, throughout the educational system. If we are going to create equity, we have to deal with racism, both attitudinally and systemically, because if we don't, we'll just keep recreating these disparities and this pain and this conflict between white folks and folks of color for generations on end with no end in sight. We deserve better than that. Y'all are going to be the leaders of the next generation who can try to make something better. And unless we can figure out how to make these interests converge, or just to demonstrate how they already converge, we're never going to get where we need to be. So I applaud all of you for putting together this great conference. I hope the rest of it goes well. I'm looking forward to the Q&A session, which we'll move to now. I just really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and to share some framing thoughts that I hope were helpful. And then we'll just slide into the Q&A right now. Again, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim, for that amazing keynote presentation. We will now move into our Q&A portion of the program, and I would like to thank the participants who included questions for Tim along with their registration. We sorted through them and have picked several questions that we will be addressing during this time.
Okay.
I'd also like to thank you again, Tim, for giving us this time to address some of the questions from our participants this morning. I'll be keeping track of the time, and we'll give a 5-minute notice as we get close to the end of our Q&A session.
Great.
For the first question, We have, what do you think is the best way to help college students engage in discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, I think ultimately colleges and universities need to require that we get practice in doing that. You know, not everybody's going to come to college with that expertise or that knowledge of how to do it, let alone, you know, with the ability to do it comfortably. And especially if you're coming to a college and maybe have never really been in even remotely diverse place before, and now you're coming up, you know, meeting all kinds of different people, you're going to have practice to get good at that. And so I think colleges need to remove the option of opting out. You know, this can't be a voluntary thing like, oh, we're going to have a, you know, an organization that works on this and we're going to have a forum and you can either come or not. Like, I think colleges and universities need to say, listen, as part of the orientation process to coming to this institution, we're going to expect you to engage in these topics. And over the course of your time here, we're going to expect you to engage more than just that once. Like, we're going to expect you to grow and demonstrate some growth as a condition of your continued matriculation through this institution, and ultimately expect you to demonstrate competence in this area before you graduate. That may be in your academic department, or it may be with some service project, or it may be with some other type of project that you could work on with others in the community, but something that evaluates your growth in talking about and through and around these issues with others, I think is an important part. So I don't expect people to come in with that knowledge set, but I think that institutions have to expect it, because we live in a culture where, maybe more than any other culture on earth, we measure the things that we value, and we only value the things that we measure. So if we're not measuring our growth in getting better at this, we're probably not going to get better, because we don't have any metric that we can compare ourselves to. Any other job on a campus, you have metrics to gauge your progress by, right? So if somebody's job in the development department is to raise $20 million for a new stadium, or $10 million for a parking garage, or $15 million for a library addition, look, we know what the metric is. The metric is $15 million. And if you don't raise it, they're going to find somebody who can, right? And they'll replace them. We don't evaluate diversity, equity, and inclusion in that way, where we expect certain outcomes to happen and certain growth and progress to be measured. If we don't expect it, and we don't require that as a condition of evaluating, you know, the work effort of academics and faculty on the one hand, staff and administration on the other, and students, then it'll just be a crapshoot as to whether we actually succeed. So I think we have to actually try to build in some requirements for this conversation and for this work into the process of getting a job at the university, you know, graduating from the university, and the way that we evaluate people's work product once they are at the university.
Thank you so much. Our second question is, how does privilege play into our unwillingness to take ownership in our own DEI growth? And how does our unwillingness and unintentional investment in this work perpetuate systemic oppression and continued historical trauma on BIPOC folks?
So I think the first mechanism for that is the obliviousness that I talked about a bit in the speech, right? That when you have the luxury of being oblivious to other people's reality, you probably will remain oblivious to it, right? The only way you break out of that obliviousness is to have some kind of experience that opens your eyes, or to have, going back to the answer to the first question, an institution or set of people in an institution that pry your eyes open as a requirement, right? In the schools, in the workplace, in the community. Otherwise, it's very easy to reside in that privileged space of not knowing and being able to be blissfully ignorant, right? The common phrase is, you know, ignorance is bliss. Well, it is, but that bliss is very dangerous, because the more blissfully unaware I remain, where my mind is not troubled by the things that other people are experiencing, the more likely that I'm going to contribute to their ongoing marginalization. And not because I'm a bad person, not because I've actually sat down and said, gosh, how can I hurt Indigenous people today, right? Or how can I hurt Black folks today? Are there people that think those things? Yeah, of course. But is that the majority? No, I would say by and large, when Black and brown folks are injured within this culture and society and its institutions, more often than not, it's not because there's, the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, pulling the strings, trying to hurt them. It's mostly because we operate our systems on the basis of an internal and historical logic that we have failed to question and failed to interrogate. And if you fail to question it and interrogate it, you can't change it. And so I think we end up perpetuating that injury by virtue of not asking the difficult questions, and we don't ask the difficult questions because we're not required to do so. Ideally, it would be best if we started these conversations long before folks walked into a college, right? I mean, ideally, you want students to come to college with years of this under their belt. Realistically, we know that isn't always the way it's going to be. It should be, and parallel to the work that you all are doing as a college, K-12 institutions ought to be doing too. Teachers ought to be doing, parents ought to be doing, community leaders ought to be doing. But regardless of what others do, we have to be willing to do our part. And part of that means challenging that privilege of obliviousness. And I think really speaking about privilege as that more than any other thing. I think what gets us sidetracked and makes people defensive and makes people resist the conversation is they have a very limited conception of what privilege means. And they think that it's a moral judgment, right? That I'm judging you as some silver spoon in the mouth, elite, when in fact, that's only one small part of what privilege looks like. Does it look like that for some people? Yeah, that's class privilege, but there's also race privilege and gender privilege and able-bodied privilege and straight and cisgendered privilege and all these other areas. And all of us have got some. I think one of the ways you might be able to break through some of the defensiveness is to acknowledge this point that a lot of times we don't acknowledge, which is most everybody that I've ever spoken to, well, not most, everybody to whom I've ever spoken and anybody I've ever met, I guarantee you, has some area where they have privilege over other people. So Black and brown folks obviously don't have race privilege in this society, but if they're men, they may have sex and gender privilege. If they're affluent, they may have class privilege. I mean, not may have, they will have. And if they're men, they will have male privilege and patriarchal privilege. If they're straight or cisgendered, they will have privilege on the basis of gender identity and sexuality and sexual orientation. If they are able-bodied, they will have able-bodied privilege. If they are English speakers in this culture, they will have linguistic privilege, right? There are all these different, if they're Christians, they'll have religious privilege in a society that is rooted in Christian hegemony. I've never met anyone who is nothing but marginalized. No one. I mean, I'm sure there might be such a person on the planet. I have not met them. And I doubt seriously any of them would be living in the United States, because by definition, if you're living in the wealthiest nation on earth, you're going to have certain privileges relative to people in poorer nations. So everyone in this country for sure has got some area where they're dominant. And if you have an area where you're dominant, you have the luxury of being oblivious to anyone who's in a different category, meaning we all have got blind spots, right? We've all got areas where we're not seeing clearly, because our lens is affecting what it is we see and what it is we don't see. Having the humility to own that, having the humility to acknowledge the way that our lens can be distorted, means that it isn't just white folks and white men and straight white men who have to change our lenses. Everybody's got an area where they need to shift their lens. It may be around sexuality, maybe around gender, maybe around disability, maybe around class or religion or linguistic or citizenship status. But whatever it is, keep in mind that there are people who are experiencing the institutions very differently than you. And if you have that humility and you're willing to really explore what your privilege of obliviousness means in any of those categories. Some of us will have it in a lot of categories. Other people might only have it in one or two. But if you're willing to explore what it means in those categories, other people will be willing to explore what it means in theirs. So it's about going first, right? I've talked to a lot of scholars of color over the years who teach on college campuses. And one of the tricks that they mention as being one of the few that seems to work when they, like, let's say they're a professor in a sociology department or something, and they're talking about issues of privilege and racism and inequality. And it's hard because here you have a lot of times it's a woman of color telling me this, a woman of color who's a scholar and an academic at a college. And she'll tell me, like, for years, I would try to get through to my white students on this, and they would always be defensive, and I would always get negative evaluations and pushback. And then they would say, look, I still get that, but increasingly I'm able to at least reach a good number of them by putting myself, they say, in the picture of privilege. And so even though this would be a woman of color who doesn't have gender privilege, doesn't have race privilege, but she can talk about, well, you know, I'm the one with the PhD, so I've got educational privilege over you. I'm the professor. I get to give you a grade. That gives me a certain amount of power over you. I may be straight. I may be able-bodied. I may be whatever, right? I'm middle to upper middle class in terms of my income, perhaps. Whatever it is, if they put themselves in the picture and talk about their own privileges and the obliviousness that that can create, then they find that the other people in the room are willing to go, oh, well, okay, here are mine, right? It's like, if I go first, you'll be willing to meet me halfway, but you don't want to go first because it's scary. But if I go first and I'm willing to, you'll be more likely to open up about your own obliviousness because you know you're not going to be judged. If I just told you that I'm oblivious on some things, then you know that if you tell me that you are too, I'm not going to yell at you. I'm not going to shame you. I'm not going to attack you, right? We're going to talk about what that means. And so part of it is providing the space for people to own their own stuff. Everybody's got some of it. You know, my colleague and a friend of mine, Jackie Wade, used to talk about this as, you know, everybody's got a couple of nickels in the quarter. And some of us might have a couple of dimes in the quarter, but everybody's got a nickel or two in the quarter. And if we just own our nickels, so to speak, then we can get to a place that's far better than the place we are now when it comes to these conversations.
Thank you. Our third question is a three-part question. We have, what does it mean to be anti-racist? How can educators and people in general promote anti-racism in schools and in their own communities? And how do we begin the conversation about and around racism?
Well, I think to be anti-racist means to be actively challenging policies, practices, and procedures that produce or reinforce existing racial inequities, right? So racism needs to be understood as a systemic force, not just an interpersonal individual force. If all we're doing is speaking out against individual interpersonal racism, that's not really enough to be anti-racist, because although that's part of it, racism is also a system. We know that because it ends with the letters ISM, right? Whenever you have an ism, that's usually going to be a system. You think of capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, authoritarianism, whatever. What are those? Well, they're ideas. Yeah, they're ideologies, but they're also systems, right? They're ways of actually organizing the society. And so if I'm going to be anti-racism, I have to be opposing those systemic forces, not just the interpersonal ones, that produce disparity on the basis of race, because racism at the institutional and systemic level, that's what it is. It's inequity based on race. It starts with the premise that there is no such thing as a superior race or an inferior race. And as a result, if you see disparities, especially sizable ones, between, let's say, white folks on the one hand and black and brown folks on the other, there are only two ways to really understand those. Number one is to conclude in an overwhelmingly racist way that, well, I guess black people are just inferior. You know, they're just not as good. They don't work as hard. I guess indigenous people are just lazy. You know, they're inferior, and white people are smarter and more hardworking. And that's why those inequities exist. That's theory number one. If you believe that, you're a racist. I mean, no exceptions. If that's what you think, you are engaged in racism. The only other possible explanation for those disparities, especially large ones that can't just be random, right, when they're significant, is that the history of inequity and the history of unequal access and opportunity, combined with ongoing discrimination in many instances, produce those disparities. So it's the weight of the past combined with the present. It's Newton's first law of motion, right? Which says, most of us think of it as the law of inertia, but it's Newton's first law of motion, which says an object in motion tends to remain in motion. Well, that's true. If you roll a ball down a hill, it's going to keep rolling until it either hits a wall or some other object that stops it, or it flattens out on a flat surface and now the friction slows it down and stops it, or somebody picks it up. We understand inertia in the physical universe, but it also applies to the political and the socioeconomic universe. So the things that happen in one generation affect the next and the next and the next and the next, until there are forces brought to bear that can stop that forward motion. And so if the history's been one of racism and racial inequity, unless you actively push against it, it will continue to go in the same direction. Bev Tatum talks about this in her work. Beverly Daniel Tatum talks about it like when you go to an airport and you have the moving sidewalks, right? You don't have to put any effort in to get from point A to point B. All you got to do is stand on that thing and it'll keep moving you there, right? If you want to not go where it's taking you, you have to turn around and exert actual effort to move in the opposite direction. And it can be difficult depending on the speed of the moving sidewalk, right? Same is true here. If you stand still, you're not being anti-racist. If you just speak out every now and then against people who are overtly racist, you're not being anti-racist. It's still going to move you in that direction. You have to actively push against it and try to challenge those disparities. The way that we begin, which I think was the second part of that, particularly as educators, is I think to insist that our institutional spaces interrogate their policies and their practices and their procedures to determine which of those are contributing to inequity or might be, and which of those are helping to produce greater equity. Because a lot of times, if you don't interrogate your practices and you just sort of take them for granted, you'll miss a lot of stuff, right? And so even with the best of intentions, even if you want to be anti-racist and you want to challenge the disparities that pop up within our institutional spaces, you'll never know how to do that unless you really do a close interrogation of the policies that you're currently operating with. And so everything from recruitment and outreach, right, in terms of where we find our students, where we find our professors, where we find our staff, to financial aid availability, to marketing of the institution, to the admissions process and the admissions expectations, to the curriculum and the requirements for graduation and what's expected of people. You can go through just a whole litany of things where the policies in place, maybe they're just in place because that's sort of how we've always done stuff. You know, a lot of schools have certain ways of doing things that are just about the tradition and sort of this is what we've always done. And a lot of times jobs are filled that way. They're filled through networking and somebody put in a good word for somebody else, or oh, look, we evaluated all these resumes and this person seems to have more qualifications. Well, here's the problem. You know, if you've had more opportunity, right, to develop your resume, if you've had more access to really good opportunities, your resume should look better, shouldn't it? Like you should have better on paper credentials if you've had a head start. It doesn't mean you're necessarily better at the job. Doesn't mean you're necessarily more qualified. It just means you started the race early. If I got a 5-lap head start on you in an 8-lap race, I should hit the tape first. That's how it works, right? But if I had a 5-lap head start, what happens if you're only 3 laps behind at the end? Well, you were a faster runner by definition. If I was picking a track team, I'd want you, not me, right? But we don't think about that when we evaluate job applicants, or when we evaluate students, right? Who maybe seem like they're behind where other students are, but think if they've overcome obstacles that other people didn't have, they might actually be more qualified for the entrance at the college, or more qualified for the job at the college, or whatever, right? And so it's just about interrogating all these things, sort of being willing to explore and examine the things that we take for granted, because the things that we take for granted are the things that get us in trouble. And then the third part of the question I forgot. Could you restate that part?
Yes. So how do we begin the conversation about and around racism?
Oh, I think we begin by defining it. And so what I said a second ago about really understanding what racism is, moving out of the personal into the institutional. And the reason that's important isn't just because it's intellectually accurate. It's because it's actually a good way to make this conversation, I think, less personal. And that's an important thing if you're going to try to bring new people into the conversation. One of the reasons people get defensive, right, is that if you talk about racism and they're thinking that you're calling them racist, it's understandable that they would shut down, right? Like if someone thinks that you're attacking them, right, and judging them and calling them a racist when they know that's a bad thing to be, at least we've made that much progress, right? 100 years ago, nobody would have cared. 50 years ago, very few people would have cared. But now people know they're not supposed to be racist. So we've made some progress in that regard. If I think you're calling me that, I think you're judging my morality and my human decency and like calling me a bad person, right? So I get pissed about that. And then I don't want to hear anything you have to say. Part of getting through that is talking about racism not as you're a bad person. Racism is what racists do, right? Racism is what bad, bigoted, mean, nasty people do. And you're that person. It's about saying, no. Racism, first of all, is only partly about that stuff. You know, Racism is about these institutional realities of inequality brought about by generations of unequal treatment. And you're not to blame for that in 2021, but you inherit that. This isn't about making you feel bad. This isn't about guilt. This isn't about shaming white people. This is not about any of that. It's about saying we all inherit the legacy of everything that came before. And if we understand that as a systemic reality, then I don't have to feel attacked or judged or talked down to. It's just like, yeah, just think about it, right? We all reap the good and the bad of everything that's come before. And if what has come before has created massive inequality, now we have a responsibility, not because we're guilty of having done it, but because we're here and we inherit it, we have a responsibility to now figure out how we move through that and how we fix that, how we correct that. And so I think we start by really clarifying the concept of what we're talking about so that people don't feel that they're being personally judged. We're making a sociological assessment of the world we live in. We're not judging anyone's psychology. We're not judging your soul. We're not judging your decency and humanity, what kind of person you are. I start off with the assumption in my work that most people are good people. I really believe that, right? I could be wrong, but I choose to believe that most folks are pretty good folks who don't want to hurt people. But if you're a good person caught up in a bad system, it's very hard not to be affected by that bad system. You'll be on that moving sidewalk and not even know that you're on it. And so that's how I think we begin the conversation.
Thank you. Our next question is, how have you navigated being white while speaking for people of color? In So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo, she talks about passing the mic to people of color. So how do you work that into your career to give people of color a voice?
So first, let me clarify in reference to the first line of the question. I am not looking to, nor do I think what I am doing is speaking for people of color. I don't think white folks should ever try to speak for people of color. It's one of the reasons that when I talk about these issues, I don't spend a lot of time talking about the perspective of Black and brown peoples with regard to this issue, because if I were doing that, that would be redundant. There are plenty of Black and brown folks who got that and who are on that every day talking about what it means to be Black or brown in America. So my talk today was very much about how that experience, which I don't claim to be an expert in, though I can offer some statistics and some data, how that connects to the white experience. I'm not talking for Black and brown folks. I'm speaking about the impact of white supremacy on the larger society, including those of us who are white within it. One of the big mistakes is thinking racism is a Black person issue and a brown person issue. And so as long as BIPOC folks are in charge of that, like just let them run that. Well, they should be the ones in charge of the movement. They should be the ones choosing the strategies for the movement, and always have been, and I think always should be and will be. But the idea that it's their issue means that they're going to have to carry all the weight. And I don't see how that's an anti-racist move. That's not an ally move. That's not solidarity saying, well, here, y'all do all the heavy lifting, right? Now, as far as the as what Ijeoma talks about in her book, and it's a great book, all of her work, her newest book called Mediocre is also just an amazing exploration of how we keep getting very mediocre white men running everything. Fantastic book that I highly recommend. The ways that I do that are a couple things, right? Number one is when I started doing this work, having been trained by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans, who very much so Black-led organization that said, like, you know, you have to think in terms of accountability. You have to think about, as a white person doing this work, how can you do it in the most accountable way? There was never any question that I should do it or that other white folks should, but how can you do it in an accountable way, in a way that does not detract from the efforts of Black and brown peoples, but instead helps to supplement that work, amazing work that they're doing. So for me, one of the things that meant was that when I started out, especially traveling around the country talking about these things, I started off as a community organizer, and I was working under the leadership and mentorship of Black people. But when I went out on the road, one of the things that I wanted to do was make sure that I was working with an organization whose purpose and function was to empower voices of peoples of color. So for the last 26 years, I have really very proudly been associated, actually 27 years this year, have been proudly working with a nonprofit organization, racial justice and social justice organization, Speak Out, which is technically a speakers bureau, but it doesn't function like a normal speakers bureau. Number one, it's nonprofit. Number two, it is only radical and progressive educators. 80% of the speakers and artists represented by Speak Out are Black and brown peoples and leaders in community activism, some of whose names are very well known, Angela Davis, Mark Lamont Hill, et cetera, but others of whom are younger and amazing emerging voices for racial justice. And by working with Speak Out, 25% of my speaker's fee goes to that organization to help them promote the voices of a lot of those other folks whose names are not as well known, so that they can become more well-known and heard, and heard on campuses and in communities. So by making sure that 25% of my fee goes to that organization, it directly helps to not just pass the mic, but make sure that there are mics to be passed. Because a lot of the work that Speak Out does, no other speakers bureaus out there doing. No one else is really committed to, even the good speakers bureaus that represent some good people. They're not committed to the educational mission of Speak Out. They're not committed to the political liberatory mission of Speak Out, and they're not helping to push a disproportionately Black and brown cohort out there into the community for that purpose. And so for me, being able to steer a quarter of my income, a quarter of my fee into that work is a way that I've been able to empower and amplify the voices of a lot of Black and brown folks over the last quarter century. So that's been, for me, a way that I can be more accountable in terms of what the People's Institute taught me to do in the early and mid 90s in New Orleans when I started out. And so there are some other ways, but that for me is the big one. And everyone is going to have their own way of doing it. Sometimes it's also sharing the stage. I love doing events with folks of color, especially events. It's a lot of times it's me and a woman of color who will do like a joint presentation. I love doing those and would love to do more of those once we get out of COVID, going and doing those, events live. I've done a couple dozen of those over the years. Would gladly do more if institutions would be down for that, because I think those are some of the best events that I've had over the years. And of course, also, helping to promote the work of Black and brown folks. So whether it's Ijoma Oluo's books or, Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Cast, is an amazing book. Carol Anderson's book, White Rage. Also, One Person, No Vote, her follow-up looking at voting rights issues. Ibram Kendi, of course, his work. All of the Black and brown folks whose work I reference in my writing, to make sure that folks know that, yeah, it's fine if you want to read my books. I'm grateful. If you want to come to my talk, that's grateful. I'm grateful for that. But there's an awful lot of Black and brown folks out here doing this work every day who also need that attention, deserve that attention, need you to buy their books and bring them to your campuses as well. And I'm glad to be a part of helping to promote that.
Our fifth question we have for you is: religious imagery in the West have powerfully conveyed assumptions about the race of God, buttressing those feelings of white supremacy. Emotional associations with these images running deep. How can religious sentiment be redirected toward inclusivity without necessarily dismantling one's faith?
Well, I think it's about being willing to challenge that imagery and talk about its origins. This is a hard conversation because people get very defensive when you start messing with their images or their thoughts about God. It's a very difficult conversation for some people to have. And by the way, not just white Christians, for instance. There are Black and brown Christians that if you start messing with their conception of Jesus, which is usually this white conception, that's the image that we've been given. Warner Salmon's Head of Christ is the most reproduced image of Jesus in the history of the world. It was originally, I think, painted in the 20s or the 30s, I believe. And it's been reproduced 40, 50, 60 million times. It's the, sort of profile image of Jesus with the blondish brown hair and the blue eyes and the very square jaw, none of which makes any damn sense if you know anything about the anthropology and biology and the sort of physicality of first century Palestinian Jews. It just didn't look like that. So it's an obviously absurd image, but it's one that is burned into the minds of Western Christians, including a lot of Black Christians, including a lot of Latinx Christians, including a lot of Asian Christians, including a lot of indigenous Christians, right? And so undoing that imagery is going to require some really deep discussions. And it is a fine line between sort of attacking a person's faith and saying, hey, can we just explore this? Now, the good news is I've done this a few times. And I didn't know the first time that I was ever asked to speak about that, because I'd written about it and I've spoken on TV about it a few times, but that's a different kind of thing. When you actually go and you're in front of a religious audience talking about this, it can, it's a whole different ballgame, right? And so I went to speak in Abilene, Texas, which before I got there, they told me Abilene is the second most conservative city in America. I don't know what the first most conservative city is, and I'm not sure I want to know, but they swore to me Abilene was number 2. And I was speaking at Abilene Christian, which is a Christian college, very conservative college in Abilene. And one of the talks that I was there for like a day and a half, and one of the presentations I was doing was about this very subject. And I was just going to go for it because, that's why they brought me in. They knew what I was going to do. So I started off, and there were people from the community. There were church leaders that came, there were clergy that came. There were Christian charity group folks that came, the nonprofits. And I just laid it out. And I said, look, we need to really talk about this iconography a minute and where this imagery of Jesus came from, where this imagery of God came from, because these haven't always been the images. Some of the earliest images of Jesus, for instance, were very clearly of a North African / Palestinian, because really what we call the Middle East is North Africa. We just don't like to call it that. I'll leave it to your imagination as to why we don't like to call it that. But that region, the earliest images and representations of Jesus were of people that clearly look like that. There are images right now in the Vatican, in artwork at the Vatican, of a Black Madonna and child, of brown and darker skinned images of Jesus, which would be far more accurate, obviously, than Warner Salmon's Head of Christ or any of the images that are in most of our stained glass. So those images existed early on. At some point, they change. Right? At some point they change, and there's a long history as to why they change and who changed them and for what purpose. And of course, it was all part of European domination and what later would become white supremacy that changes those images. So to have that conversation is not an attack on faith. It doesn't question what you think about Jesus. It questions why you needed to make, if the 10 Commandments include the provision that you ought not have graven images, right? And you shall have no other God before me, right? And if your assumption about creation is that God makes man in God's image, makes people in God's own image, then why is it that people have made God in people's image, right? So you start to ask these critical questions that are actually respectful of faith. It's not about challenge. It's not about saying you're an idiot for thinking this way. It's about saying, wait a minute, I thought you said you shouldn't have other gods before me, but you're now sort of creating a graven image of a God as a white man, right? Which doesn't make any sense historically. And you're actually inverting the cause and effect relationship. You're mankind creating God in your image, not God creating mankind in God's image. And so now you're asking these critical questions. And when I did that, I was pleased to experience the reaction, which was, wow, these are really important questions that we need to be having, because there's an impact that imagery has, right? It essentially says to those of us who are white that we're closer to divinity, that we're closer to the creative force of the universe, whatever you conceive that to be. And it says to Black and brown peoples that they are farther away from the creative energy of the universe and therefore spiritually lesser. And I think we can have that conversation, not only in a way that doesn't attack faith, but in a way that's actually about saying, is that the kind of faith that you want to have? One that, because ask yourself, like, if we actually had a Polaroid of Jesus, like if you actually had an image of what Jesus would have looked like and what first century Palestinians almost inevitably did look like, what would the white folks in those white evangelical churches do with that new image? How would it change everything? How would it change their politics? How would it change their ideology? How would it change their view towards movements like Black Lives Matter? How would it change their view of brown immigrants, right? If they really had to think about Jesus as a brown-skinned migrant at one point as a child, or being chased out and having to run to Egypt, which is what the Bible says he did when they were looking for him as a child, right? They sent him to Egypt. They didn't send him to Sweden or whatever was there before Sweden. They sent him to Egypt, which was a brown-skinned place, right? That's what the Bible says. I'm just reading y'all's book. Like I'm an agnostic. So for me, it's not even a thing, but for people for whom that's a big thing, like this is what the book says. So what would happen if Christians had to examine God in a different light, Jesus in a different light, all of these figures in a different light? I think it would change everything. And I think we want to indulge that conversation and at least ask, why do we have this image? Some folks won't want to have that conversation, but I think if we indulge it, we can have it, and it can be a productive one.
Thank you so much, Tim, for your thought-provoking answers to all of our questions. There were so many more questions that were submitted, but we just didn't have time to ask all of them. And we learned so much, and we hope and encourage everyone to continue their DEI growth as this is an ongoing journey. And on behalf of our committee and our campus, we extend our deepest appreciation in having you spend this time with us and helping make our C.E.A.D conference a success.
You bet. Thank you so much for having me. Have a great rest of the conference.
Okay, everyone, it is a little bit after 10:50. So we would like to now take a short break and meet you back here at 11 a.m., where we will be introducing our spoken word artist, Matt Sedillo. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome everyone back. We're so glad to have you back with us. Our next presenter is a spoken word artist who is joining us from California. Matt Sedillo has been described as the best political poet in America, as well as the poet laureate of the struggle by academics, poets, and journalists alike. He has appeared on C-SPAN and has been featured in the Los Angeles Times, among other publications. He has spoken at Casa de las Americas in Havana, Cuba, and at numerous conferences and forums such as the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in American Higher Education, and at over 100 universities and colleges, including the University of Cambridge and Stanford University, among many others. Please join me in welcoming Matt.
How you doing? Let's get started. Sundown, Levittown, Fort Apache, Dirty Harry, John Wayne, Blackface, Minuteman, Moynihan, Gone with the Wind, Breaking Bad. Washington, Redskin, Confederate flag, the sword, the dollar, the cannon, the scholar, the cavalry, and the Ivy League history is written by lightning as the rising smoke of burning village. The ways in which victors keep their victims, a frontier thesis and notes on the state of Virginia, extraction, expansion, the winning of the West, Lewis and Clark, Smith and Wesson, a circle the wagon with bloodshed and slave sweat, the crack of the whip, the law of 3/5, the crown republic of King Cotton, the intended failures of Reconstruction, the housing covenants that greeted great migrations, the same to the Mexicans in poor Mexico. So far from heaven and so close to Monroe Doctrine, to Davy Crockett, to prison industrial complex, a war on drugs is a war on our young. Bloody Christmas, Reefer Madness, 15 to life for 4 ounces, East Oakland, West Baltimore, South La Brea, and Auburn North, Plymouth Rock, Jamestown, the Rio Grande, stolen lives, stolen land. See, some were born in summer homes and palatial groves where pain was only to ever unfold from the pages of secret gardens of Redfern groves, but not I. See, I come from the stock of star-eyed astronauts who greet the night sky with big dreams and wide eyes, always running down the Devil's Highway through occupied America, all the way back to house on Mango Street, and those are the books you don't want us to read. Raised on handball up the back wall of a panaderia born east the river, post Mendez versus Westminster, one generation with the red lines, and diplomas that were signed that those dreams and that skin need not apply. See, I come from struggle. And if my story offends you, it was because you made the mistake of seeking your reflection in my self-portrait. See, this may not be about you, because some are born in the common core. Reflected faces grace the pages of doctrines discovered and age to be explored. World hardships crashed against new shores, New England, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York. For others, pushed off Turtle Island. Aslan, do not call this brown-skinned immigrant. Child of the sun. Son of the conquest, Mexicano blood, running through the veins, east side of Los Angeles. I tell him in native tongue, a song will best be sung. Do not tell me who I am, because I was raised just like you. Miseducated in some of those very same schools, off lessons and legends of honest Indians and Christian pilgrims and a nation of immigrants, all united in freedom. That is until they pulled aside my white friend, pointed directly at me and said, "Scott, I judge you by the company you keep, and you spend your time with this." The same old story, it's 1846. The adventures of Uncle Sam, the stick-up man, he went back. Show me your papers, now give me your labor. The melting pot was never made for the hands to clean it. The American dream has always come at the expense of those who tucked it in. You don't know that, because you don't teach it. Could write you a book, but you won't read it, so you know what? This is about you. And 1492, and the Treaty of Guadalupe and California missions and Arizona schools, these racists that try to race us as raise their kids in cities that bear our names, but you can learn some today, from Ferdinand to Minuteman, from Arpaio to Alamo, from Popo Budio, so Joaquin the Indian, as it Liz and me, from 808 to 43, try to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds, Canadian mines, Lino Strike, the Plan de Hala, Bizzapata, Joaquin Murrieta, Las Agalitas, Brown Berezi, Zapatistas, Richard Nixon, third Napoleon, from Peckinpah to Houston, from Losa Republic to Christopher Columbus, all the way down to Donald fucking Trump. We didn't cross the borders. The borders crossed us. Who you calling immigrant? Pilgrim? So this is a little bit of an unusual experience because you know, I'm a performer, so I'm used to kind of a little more interaction, but I'm gonna get through it, and so will you. So here we go. I'm gonna tell you a little. I'll tell you a little story before I go on. My name is Matt Sedillo. As you know, it's an interesting kind of thing when you start building up a resume. You have to start living up to your resume. So it's always kind of like, I hope I can live up to all those nice things people have said about me. But yeah, what I do for a living is I go around, speak at universities, speak at colleges, and you know, I get to, you know, it's an interesting life. I can remember this time. I want to tell you two stories before I continue. Um, I remember when I was in Washington State, speaking at the university over there, Evergreen State. Um, After a show, I was speaking with you know, some friends, which was kind of like a little after party, and you know, the conversation started winding into kind of interesting territory, and I started talking about when my grandfather had passed away, and how all of us were sitting around the bed, right, and all the men were like making eye contact, right, and we were like making sure not to cry, right. It was very weird, but I could tell what was happening, and I was engaged in it too. And the women were crying, and it was so ridiculous because we were trying to be strong for them for some reason, but like nobody cared about any of that, you know. We were watching this man that we loved, this man who meant so much to all of us, draw his last breath, and this is what we were worried about, right? And so that's just like how that kind of thing just robs you of your life, you know, that kind of patriarchal, masculine kind of thing does that. Another person started sharing a story. You know, she was a black woman from Newark, New Jersey, and she started telling a story about how she was raised by her mother and her sister, and how all these qualities that, you know, required of them to make their, you know, way in this world, and as black women, you know, particularly, um, all this oppression, all these things that required them to be really strong and tough, and endure a lot of things, and all these qualities that would be, you know, lionized, that would be championed in men, were seen as like wrong and transgressive and criminal and dangerous in women, and particularly black women. And so, like, you know, how horrible that was. And then a white woman spoke, and she said, well, you know, in the Hopi tradition, right? Because she didn't really understand what was happening. What was happening was that we were telling these really intimate, painful stories about our lives. And she just thought, oh, it's time to talk about ethnic people, right? Another incident here in Los Angeles was a friend of mine asking me to help him write this story. And I said, oh, sure, of course, John, anything, man. You know, we're writers, right? So we're part of that kind of that siblinghood of you know, writers, right? And so I meet up with him, and he tells me, yeah, I got this. I'm writing this story, but it calls for a character, and I'm just not sure how to go about it. And I'm like, well, tell me about it. Tell me what's going on. He said, well, he's a Vietnamese cook. I'm like, well, I got to stop you right there, John. I'm not Vietnamese. And he said, well, yeah, but you are a man of color. So the point of telling both these stories is to tell a story that you really need to understand who you are yourself and who is in front of you, right? Because if you're just reading this world of just a world of like, well, I'm white and those are the people of color, or you know, like, well, you know, you should understand this because you're a person of color. The world is big, the world is complex, and it's full of all kinds of people with very complex histories, right? And I would really, really argue that in this period of time, coming out of these last 4 years, it's very, very much behooving everyone to really study up on Chicano studies, and to understand the history of the Mexican-American War, to understand the history of the Mexican border. Because when you think about Donald Trump and how he rose to power, the way he cleared the Republican primaries was to talk about, you know, Mexico sending drug dealers and rapists, was a demonization and criminalization of Mexicans, bad hombres, all these kinds of things. This guy can't judge me. He's Mexican. You know, when he was president, he told the prime minister of Japan, I'll send you 22 million Mexicans. You'll never win an election. So it's all this constant like battering against Mexicans, the Mexican border, demonization of Central Americans, all kinds of things like this. And where does that history come from? Because those are specific histories. Those histories are rooted in things that happened specifically to those groups of people. You can't just generalize and say it's racism. I mean, you have to understand that, like California, the state that I'm in right now, you know, the first state apparatus of law enforcement here was the California Rangers, and they were set up to hunt Mexicans, the five Joaquins. The Greaser Act of 1855 was the first anti-vagrancy law. You know, it was one of the first anti-vagrancy laws in America, and it was against, you know, what they called, you know, Indians of Mexican descent. So all these things have a history. They're a long history. It's rooted in things like, you know, a recent history like Prop 187, recent history like SB 1070. All those kinds of politics are what informed Donald Trump's initial rise. So you can't just say it's racism. You have to look at the very specific roots and histories. I mean, you look at Ann Coulter's book, Adios America. Well, that was rooted in previous books written by Samuel Huntington called Who Are We? Written Pat Buchanan. So all these things have a very specific history. There's a specific thorough line, and it behooves all of us to learn these things as part of our general toolkit when we're talking about, fighting racism. And so my poetry is very, very historically informed. So here's another poem. This poem comes straight out of Los Angeles. It's called La Reina. Los Angeles full of abuelas who raise grandkids in Spanglish and the watchful eye walk down with the Virgin Jesus. Make a village out of a duplex raised Catholic, but the roots are indigenous. 7 generations of family extension all growing in one plot. Hand-me-downs into shared rules, rooms, and reflections. In la quech porque mi casa es tu casa, that's your promises, family living. That's palabra. Light a candle. Burn some sage, pick your saints at your altar, the sign of the cross. The sound of the conch, prayers lift the 4 directions, that's culture, not contradiction. Folks in the back, they fight for living, 515 hail from the rowdy section, Dodger Stadium, but their hearts still burn with the fire from that Chavez ravine, and here is home of La Reina. At 54 cents on the dollar, America's most exploited worker, neglected, disrespected, underrepresented, presumed incompetent. If she lives life as expected, she'll be labeled statistic. If she managed to outpace them, threaten, they will blame her for affirmative action. By the way, they will not see her. They will demand her labor, paid and unpaid, smiling, her eyes humble and her mouth silent. Lay the river. Cities past, present, and future. Queen of angels. Invisible to those who float. Through canyons, lagoons, and cemeteries, whitewashing adobe through a series of fevered dreams connected by a bridge called her back to those who make demands. The stories told to bury the past, the ones that serve to remind her that she works for them, that she is lucky to even have a job here in el pueblo. Nuestra Señora, La Reina, Los Ángeles del Rio, por $5 it's called La La Land. Since the 80s with the pueblo, 1890s brickyards in Montebello built one again, only beaten and shot. One for no Mexicans, no dogs, one for the rules, written to the schools, only written out the history of a city. We founders, we are priced out of the homes of our mothers. Yet more and more of greater Los Angeles suddenly discovered this is a struggle of our forebears. O pan, historia eterna, victoria, siempre the struggle is real. La lucha sigue, La Reina de Los Ángeles on the front lines of every fight, holding it down, holding the better half of the sky, fighting, gentrification, fighting for education, fighting for tenants' rights, fighting la migra, la jura, polici, chingla ice, fighting for dignity, hers and ours, all the damn time, proud and brown and brown and proud of the hearts and hands, the backbone of these race fists. So we throw 2 fingers up. We say Donald Trump, that's not identity politics. That is a cry of the proletariat at 54 cents on the dollar. She is the face of it. So when you see her, pushing some other stores, locked behind cash, registering the 3rd, 4th, 5th, shift to the oppressed, show some respect, bow your head, bend the knee, all hail La Reina, the once and future queen. So what I really want to tell you, what another thing I want to convey is, especially with the speech we just heard, is, that when we look at like these things I'm talking about right now, our struggle, the struggle of, struggle I'm specifically talking about right now, Chicano struggle is really also class struggle. I mean, it is class struggle. If you look at some of these very important cases in history, it's not just these struggles for a particular group or for this. I mean, these things affect everyone. So, back in I think 1966, you may have heard this case. I mean, I'm mostly probably heard this thing maybe on television, maybe not an actual experience, but you have the rights to remain silent. You have the rights to an attorney, right? Well, where does that come from? That comes from a case called Miranda versus Arizona. And who does that come from? It comes from a guy named Ernesto Miranda, who was, this Mexican guy in Arizona, who the cops beat up and didn't tell him his rights. And the reason he was able to win that case was a case 2 years earlier, Escobedo versus Illinois, 1964, right? So that case informed Arizona Miss Miranda. Can you guess what nationality Danny Escobedo was? Again, another case of Mexican. Another case, and particularly important to education, is you have 2 cases: Serrano versus Priest in California, and Rodriguez versus San Antonio. And Rodriguez versus San Antonio went all the way to the Supreme Court, and what they were arguing was that the school districts should not be funded like just by zoning, by the local income, but rather like have a nationally funded education system that is actually discriminatory, that was actually a violation of the 14th Amendment. And the Supreme Court Justice Powell, he argued that education is not a constitutional right. And that'd be an extremely powerful tool in the hands of all kinds of educators to fight for it. But people don't know that. Why? Because they don't know this. They don't know the story of Rodriguez versus Antonio. Why? Because it's a bunch of Mexicans. Who cares? And so it's really, really important to invest in this history to understand not just how it affects these people, but how it affects the country as a whole. Here's a poem about class struggle. It's more direct. It's called The Rich. This is a persona poem, so don't ask me for money. I'm not rich. Here you go. The rich, well, they're not like you and me. They see an opportunity, they grab it. Reach for the stars and they put them in their pocket. Company stays in the red, but they're backed by the government. Snort the public dime to lines of pure profit, research and development. The rich, well, they didn't breed. Champagne wishes and caviar dreams, thoroughbred stallions, quarter-billion mansions on the C.E.D Port Horizon, blood diamonds, golden parachutes, silicon messiahs, feasting on endangered species served on silver platters, winter palaces carved from the tips of icebergs, six-figure charters, vulture capital, million-dollar coffins, broken life like an apple, insured by suicide nets, lifestyles of the criminally negligent, but you haven't lived. So you've launched the car into space for no real reason. That's what I call freedom. The rich, well, here's how it is. Dollars and cents, trademark and rent, facts and figures, lines and ledger, derivatives and debt, building the future, increasing productivity, union busting backs to the 100-hour work week, trimming the fat, producing monopolies with real money, shorts and bets. Not my friend. It's how the rich stay rich while the rest make poor decisions. And it's pure ecstasy, living in the lap of luxury, pushing pharmaceuticals, the mark of the market will bear your body to alter a life or death bargain, the gospel of wealth, because it is what it is, and that's all it's ever been. The less we spend, the more we keep. You see, the rich and the poor, well, they're just like you and me. 2 hands, 2 feet. The sky, the sea, and everything between, one heart that beats, and the time to make the most of it. You'll find no sympathy. Reaching into these deep pockets, all we were asked was our fair share, and God damn it, that's all of it. So we out in the streets screaming for peace and justice. We sleep in satin sheets, dreaming free and guiltless over oceans and tariffs, liquidating pensions and off to bid on ports and ports at billion-dollar auctions. You don't need us. You know we're selling your secrets. You know still send us DNA kits, watching the puppets on television, debate freedom, free speech, fascism, democracy, reaching the earth, punch the ozone, and fuel the economy with space stations. Yes, space stations, hydrating the red planet. We're going to survive this lava pit. So you got pots and pans, we got deeds and plans, chopping down rainforests, colonizing the moon. We're the rich. Who the hell are you? We'll privatize the water supply and then copyright the tears falling from your eyes. Burn it all down. What are you talking about? The ice caps already melting. You want to start some shit? Eat the rich. We're already killing your kids. One carbon footprint, one gas house emission, one oil rig, one naval ship, one free trade agreement at a time. We'll get away with it too. Nothing we say or do is ever held against us. Haven't even been paying attention. We're rich. So I am recently the author of Mowing Leaves of Grass, which is a book that I wrote, got published by Flower Songs, and it's been doing pretty good. But it's interesting. I've gotten a lot of pushback for this because they're very upset that I would attack the bard Walt Whitman. But the reason I did that is because Walt Whitman is, he is somebody who was a big proponent of the Mexican-American War. And in fact, he said something to the degree of, what has miserable, inefficient Mexico do with the grand mission of peopling the new world with a noble race? And, when you do something like that, hundreds of years later, someone like me is born, and they write a book called Mowing Leaves of Grass, and we'll just see how far that goes. And who am I to say this? I don't know. I mean, according to the back of this book, I'm the best political poet in America, so we'll see. All right, here we go. I am the as-yet-written vengeance of Violet Valdez, the best laid plans of Modesto, the reckoning of Santa Cruz, San Isidro, Bisbee, Chandler, poor Veneer, the blood, sweat, and tears of all that I refuse to forget. I am that unpaid debt. No sidekick, no subplot, no mascot, no ethnic study. The universe I embody, the ground above me, the sky beneath my feet. Marching in the skies, las estrellas, circular calendar, sleep dealing, quiero saber past, the future and the present. In la quieto all at once, this moment I'm you are me, and we are 2 clenched fists that still lit fire, sacred kept. The final breath called Last Fighting Aztec, laughing in the face of death, the blade of El Pachuco guarding the temple steps, the strength of the past, the promise of tomorrow. Yo soy Chicano, y Chicano soy, donde me lleves, el Chicano voy. They want anything that's important. Critical to your rehabilitation for the way in which you enter this world. Read Thomas Jefferson, also get pregnant. Standards and practices. Curriculum and instruction, you the product of public education, do not erupt. You've been cuffed, face first to pavement like your father, your grandfather, your mother, your Nina, your tios, you learn your lessons. It's not personal. It's all you people. Don't get mad. Don't be hurt. Don't make this political. It's economic. Objective. The law of self-interest, if we let you in, will become the canon, the classics, Alexander, Napoleon, who will shelve the wit and wisdom, Ben Franklin, Shelley, Shakespeare, Chaucer, Walt Whitman, from the Palmanic, starting with his miserable, inefficient Mexico with the grand mission, the new world, the noble race you fought, you lost, you don't get to define. It's not racism, it's progress, providence, and God willing, you filthy mongrels, it is just the way it is. Look at you. Don't see color, see labor, see Cops and robbers, guards and convicts, institutions, corrections, schools that look like prisons, caged apartments. The cost of living, the cost of being brown is high as wage theft and the rent. Forget your savage tongue. I will teach you robust American love. Spoon feed you speaks freedom of speech. Don't take a joke and speak to authority. I'll show you who you are in a book and you'll believe it because I said it. Now you read it and who you to question the canon, the classics, Lowry, Kerouac, walk out on the great white brilliance of Garfield, Roosevelt, Lincoln. Now listen, this is important. The universe is a muralist. The cosmos, our self-portrait, starring a curandera, an ansante, a poet, laureate, a stylist, a mechanic, the barrio dandy cruising the rings of Saturn, the travel tips of Torres, Carrasco, tearing the curtain on Union Station, Joaquin, returning triumphant, marching through halls of Tucson, mowing down leaves of grass, fuck what women, this is an Art Lebeau dedication, Frida, Selena, Cantinflas, Luis Rodriguez, Valdez, Savannah, Sandra, Anzandua, the mighty Quinn, to all that we are and all that we've been through, lifetimes and timelines, galaxies and dimensions of pride, pain and resistance, and Gothic are the solar showers and the days of living music when the people of the sun were dancing to the tune of Valenzuela. La Luna was a calavera as the ancestors welcomed the future with the circular couch. Why am you? You are me, sitting at a desk, looking to the stars, searching for the end till poem never began. That always was, and forever shall be. All right, so this next poem here, like I said, I'm in Los Angeles, is dedicated to Los Angeles' finest. It's called Kingdom of Cages. Los Angeles, City of Pigs, Kingdom of Cages, database, the Furman tapes, the Ayers Report, Daryl Gates, Tom Bradley, Lee Baca, Willie Parker, Red Lines, Red Squads, Ryan Parks, Rodney King, the Thin Blue Line, on an all-white jury, Mercer Metropolis, the Kills for Appearance, Chicano Moratorium, 84 Olympics, Crash, the Battery Ram, Crack the CIA, Twin Towers, Operation Hammer, Six City, La Loma, Bishop, Palo Verde, Arcadia, Los Angeles City, Designed to be Divided, Postcard Paradise, Gentleman's Apartheid, Service and Protection, 41st and Central, SWAT, Watts, Sleepy Lagoon, Open Shop, Open Season, The Killer of Children, Take the Shot, They Were Sworn to Protect, so we serve as their moving targets, their bleeding borders, the open frontiers, the neighborhood threads, they shoot us, as we run, as 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 they shoot us, as we run. Jesse Romero was 14 years old and murdered by the LAPD. Los Angeles, City of Pigs, Kingdom of Cages. And I think, let's see, where are we on time? Master of Ceremonies, where are we on time?
Matt, you have 20 minutes.
I have 20 minutes?
You're scheduled to finish at 11:40.
All right. Okay. This one here, okay, so again, in talking about these things, we're talking about, getting the specific history of getting this very specific history of people of Mexican descent living in the United States of America, and the racism that we endure here in this country. Part of the depression is really actually the fact that it's talked about so little. I mean, the fact of the matter is that it happens on such a regular basis, and it's such a huge pillar. The demonization of, who will be like bad hombres, right, is really a big part of U.S. culture, and yet is not a big part of analysis, not large enough an analysis of how the country works as a whole. What ends up happening is you have a lot of this stuff done in like Chicano studies and kind of like over here on this side, but in terms of like a national discussion, a national seat at the table, a national understanding of where is all this coming from, it's really sorely lacking. So this poem is really about that kind of invisibility, that poem about that kind of just that silencing of that question. It's called Once Upon I Go Back to Mexico. Who knows, man? I mean, who really fucking knows where it all began, where the time goes, where the money went, how shit gets made, who runs the board, who calls the shots, and who gets played. See, I'm Mexican American, Chicano, U.S. born and raised. Comes next, 30, stupid, lazy, beaner, wetback, spit. The story begins, house with once upon I go back to Mexico. Once upon a 5 or 6. Sometimes these things happen a little sooner than expected. Sorry, kid. That's just the way it is. Seems like you're gonna have to make a decision. Think quick, don't flinch, thumbs out, clench fists now, forever. Hold your tongue. See, I was born in 81, which makes me young Gen X or old millennial. Shit, I don't know. Sometimes it seems like my birthright is just more questions than answers. What I do know is this. Something terrible happened around 489 years before I was born in my life. Well, it just hasn't been the same since. See, what you call microaggressions, I call mini conquests. By the water cooler, see them sailing in my mind, just like Hernan Cortez, John Smith, chest plates and muskets, shoe buckles and loaded questions, office eugenics, pointed statements like, when both took Mexico City, you should take the whole thing, or all legals are diseased, you were born here, so why are you offended? If I act like I did when I was a kid, shit, you already know what would happen. But I'm not one to repent or confess because I was not born to be forgiven. Not here, not now, not by them. Saw a man for president. Said I saw a man run for president, then heard a rainbow coalition of friends debate whether calling Mexicans drug dealers and rapists was racist or populist, and demanded discussion, a reflection, and some nuance. Why couldn't I feel the pain of people who felt nothing but hate for mine? All I could do was reflect upon my life and ask myself why. Because sometimes it seems like the more I think, the less I know. And the more I speak, the worse it gets. Even ready to fight, we don't know what the hell we're talking about. Our mouths just running, muttering something about a nation of immigrants, always trying to make sense of our lives using images not our own, some secondhand bootleg history written for us to serve them. Because the real power lies not in the pursuit of the answer, but in the posing of the question. Sometimes it seems like someone is always trying to convince me of something. Like there are things they don't want to see. Like the manipulating reality. Some nights I drive this city, I see nothing but brown faces. Go back inside, turn on television. I don't see them till I go out again. It's like we're here, but we're not. Like they want to blame us and not allow a response. Like no part of this culture is ours, like perpetually foreign, like an apartheid state of mind where they capture the imagination for the future from being born. It's like the Mexican-American War never ended. Every billboard in the city of Los Angeles screaming out some white savior shroud of penance or revolt, but everybody knows. Everybody knows. Everybody knows Jesus and Joker. Both of them are Mexican. Everybody knows how the story ends. America, what do you get? What do you get when you steal half a nation that oppresses descendants? I'll tell you what you get. You get what you fucking deserve. So it's called Pedagogy of the Oppressor. And when they read in conquest. And when they thought of process. And when they wrote again and again, it was the word progress. And when they spoke, a festival of bayonets impaled the audience, lined the children. It's getting late November. Teach them Pilgrim. Teach them Indian. Speak of gratitude. Speak of friendship. Okay, this next one is called Defend the East Side. Now this one's about gentrification, about East Los Angeles, about Boyle Heights, about City Terrace, about El Sereno, where I grew up. And so it's all these little areas that are known as kind of the east side of Los Angeles, not just East LA, but the general east side. And it's written in this kind of structure that I like to use with like kind of a 3-act structure, right? So this is kind of like just getting you into my writing process, right? So I start off with like kind of an act 1 and act 2 and act 3, right? So in act 1 of this poem is very much like remembering the dead. And act 2 is very much starting a family. And act 3 is remembering when I'm dead. So you can kind of watch the pattern as it goes. And I'll tell you more about this later. Right? The 5, the 101, the 10, Suavecito for president. A funeral procession at a city terrace, no ice on the overpass, a shot on the countertop next to Hachilaquilas, no liquor license, just a morning prayer for the dead. It's a few words to the old man, so raise your glass at 60, Atlantic and the 710 to watching the simians grow through strollers, los puntos, a brick through gentrified windows, all the better to die in defeat because life's a risk, a wedding dress off Whittier. A baptism at Our Lady, a reception at La Raza at the intersection, mission, disobey Trump in the shadow of Zapata, better late than never, my love will be standing here in 50 years like fire and memory. There are things with protection, like imagine long after I'm gone and the children grown, corazon and mariachi, watching kids flip ollies over burning effigies, America's latest flaming race, like we did when our love was young, when our eyes were locked, when our hands were bond. You will remember me driving the 60, the 5, the 710, but life still exists. This world is lived like fire, like memory, like all that's worth protecting. Defend the East Side. Okay. Thrones of blood. Thrones of blood, empires of sweat, chambers of commerce, ministers of finance, columns of debt. The law is print. It's riot script. High priests preach the evangelical, canons aim steady, the doctrine of famine and luxury, war is progress. Property is sacred, starvation is the market, your mouths are reckless, look at the gates. They're blood ready. Cabins of industry. Lords of limited liability, well-dressed murderous thieves, the modern kings of corporate speech walk among us. As loaded guns, chambers locked full of legal teams and legalese, and just enough finely printed legal degrees of separation to wash their teeth clean, predators. In every sense of the word, it is a wolf's run. The night, capitalists gather around a bonfire to listen It's a servant song. How vain are we? How vain are we, us composed of cosmic dust, set beneath the stars to chart our brief chaotic lives by the time it takes our small, fragile, distant eyes to finally see the light. Praise be the sky. Praise be the day and praise be the night with your steps moonlit. Press your face to the wind. Let the harvest drink you in. Blessed be our lungs, or how our lungs have blessed us. Your body, conduit between breath and divine. Praise be divine. Praise be the joy that it brings to your eyes. At this, both guests and hosts were pleased. At a servant, clever and observant, unburdened by the groundbreaking decisions that set the shoulders of titans, and who better than one given to a life of service to serve as a reminder to breathe easy. How forgetful are we? How forgetful are we, our tongues tripping, dripping over one another to touch up monuments, climb ladders of success, deliver the speech of self-made men. Oh, how we forget. The very soil we walk upon has been tilled by many hands, that even the tree's tallest branch grew from the same seed of the root. At this, both guests and hosts were amused. At a servant, humble yet with sense of purpose, who better than one given to a life of service to serve as a reminder of the divine order of all things. How tragic are we? How tragic indeed our whole lives, boulders and mountains in the drive to make sense of them, oceans to conquer, soil to bleed, and to each a plot of sun, a job to be done. Please, please, as we push this rock together, do not strike at us so mercilessly. At this, neither guest nor host were pleased. The night had become political. For what good is a servant whose demands exceed their purpose? The capitalist cried out, have we not been good to you? Have we not given you all that you have in all your years of service? Have you not heard? Have you not learned the law is threat? Its right is death. Look at the gates. Supreme justice reigns upon us. In the servant's quarter, the servant's daughter sings a different song. One of blood and conquest, fire and vengeance, dawn and the horizon of a new day rising, dreams of hacienda burning, reeds of the gallows, the guillotine, firing squads, and basements full of Romanov. She laughs, she weeps, she dreams, she speaks with the others. And with each passing day, they grow strong. So that one right there was a servant song. And the whole point of that one is that, you know, the fact of the matter is that we can write these beautiful things, we can make these beautiful pleas for these systems that are crushing us, that are destroying us every day in a million ways to be better to us. But it's never going to happen. Eventually, you have to fight these things. Eventually, you're going to have to fight these oppressive forces that are really out to really just make our lives miserable, and not just out to make our lives miserable, do make our lives miserable in a million ways that we don't even consider. I mean, we don't even think about. Just how the world we live in, just how really extremely coercive it is in a million different directions. So that's kind of that was the spirit of that one. So I'm gonna do two more, and then I guess that's that. Like I said earlier, it's really important to learn very specific history, so to really understand how we got to where we are, so we can know where we're going from here. And if I can be an advocate for anything, if I personally, with my life and my time, could be an advocate, it would be for people to study the history of the oppression of Chicanos, of Mexicanos, of the blood on the Mexican border, and just how that affects not just the people who experience it directly, but how it affects the shaping of American culture, of American politics. If you look at the way in which the states in the Southwest were shaped, this is not just a question, it is a driving question. And if you look at the future of the country is in the American Southwest. Right now, 7 out of 10 of the most populated cities in the United States of America are in land that was once Mexico. It is in 7 out of 10 of these cities were grabbed during the Mexican-American War, right? So that's really, really important. And these cities are growing at a rate of 10 times the size of like New York, which is obviously the country's most populated city. But their rapid growth rate, like New York's growing at a rate of like 0.5%. like Phoenix is growing at a rate of like 10% every decade. So that's kind of the future of the country. This is the general way this is going. And I would argue in many ways that is actually what kind of motivated so much of this question that had been so regional, this question that had been, you know, the way in which you would be elected governor in Arizona, the way in which you would be elected governor of California in the 90s, the way in which in many places you could still, you know, use these politics. How did that become a national question? I would argue that it became a national question because of this question of demographic threat, because of this question of fear of taco trucks. And that's just me saying that. This is the actual Republican delegates. I mean, the people that they're speaking for Trump in 2016. You had one of them saying something like, you know, am I gonna have to brush up on my Dora the Explorer? You had another one talking about there's gonna be taco trucks in every corner. You have at the Republican National Convention, you have Scott Baio, I mean, that political giant, right? Yeah, that's the guy saying, like, let's make America great again, but let's make America again. You have Lou Holtz, another, you know, a football coach, right? Another political giant. But again, these people were speaking at the Republican National Convention. And what did he say? He said, I don't want to, he said, what did he exactly say? He said, I don't want to drink your beer. I don't want to celebrate your holidays. And I don't want to watch your soccer games. I don't want to become you, right? And so what does that mean? It means that the United States of America is no longer the United States of America if there are too many Mexicans in it. And that thorough line, that question of like too many Mexicans being in one place is a pillar of American society, particularly in this region. If you look at like Arizona doesn't become a state until it has a white majority. If you look at in the 1900s, you see the Bracero program, right, where they're bringing in workers to come work the fields and then deporting them afterwards, and then bringing them in and bringing them out and pushing them in. Well, that happens at the same time as a government program called Operation Wetback, right? So it really wasn't. It's about controlling how many people are in. And so after the 90s, when they have this huge population explosion, you're seeing the results of that, and this question has become unleashed. But this question is becoming a question not just how you win in a regional area, but how you win the presidency. So this poem's about that. It's called Carved Over. Draw a map, line the sand, carve the desert, act on land, amend it, eminent domain, indefinite detention, private prisons, public referendum, gentrification, naturalization, forced sterilization, Americanization, make America great again, Mexico pay. The hunt for Murrieta, the hunt for Pancho Villa, John Pershing's slaughter of the innocents, a severed head torn in California museums becomes Zorro, becomes the Wild Bunch, becomes whitewashed. It's American life experience, it's imagination. If you can dream it, you could see it. If you could see it, you can build it. If you could build it, you could take it. If they resist, manifest a cruelty so complete that for generations they will do it to themselves. Build a city, draw its borders, patrol its districts, add injury to silence, insult without memory, protect these borders from language and culture, taco trucks, and Dora the Explorer. The country is changing, you know it. It's simple mathematics and you know it. You've kept us weak by keeping us confused. Your grandchildren will speak Spanglish in the neighborhood you grew up in, greeting their friends on the corner of your childhood and cherished memories. On a lamplight and faded mist, the historic site of your first kiss, where you learned to sink before you learned to swim, where you and she carved your names to trees and promised each other forever. The memories fade. Neighborhoods change. And your names will be carved over. And there's nothing you can do about it. And you know this too. So when Donald Trump says drug dealers and rapists, and Kelly Osbourne jumps in to direct him, no, Donald, those people are just here to clean our shit. When you sit so comfortably, speak so freely about a group of people who are somehow everywhere, yet at the same time, no one. Hold your tongue. We are far closer than you know. Okay, and this here is the final poem. This poem I'm going to read to you right now is a poem about my little hometown that I grew up in, El Sereno. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, I'll just show you. I was born on the east side of Los Angeles, across the tracks from abandoned steel, an industrial petrified forest. Across the steps, the giant green tarp protected customers and gossipers, our abuelitas, from raise the sun and the bombs of birds. It spoke Spanish, sold mangoes, papayas, and cherries, my favorite. As a child, I could never quite make the connection between the broken, empty bottles across the steps and the broken, empty men poured out the rust factories from across the tracks. So my cousins and I would gather and throw rocks of dirt aimed directly for the head. And the men would yell back something like, "What do you kids know about life?" And we yelled back, "Take that, drunks." That was messed up. That's how it was growing up where Valley climbs up and over to meet Soto. El Sereno. The 1950s, my mother's father, technician by trade, by birth a prince among men. In a backwards kingdom that held him back, that treated him different for the radiance of his unapologetic brown skin, raised a family of 6 on a single income. There is hard fought genius in me, older than my mother's womb. December 18th, 1981. After months of fear and absence, my father makes his return. My aunt moves to take hospital bed. She does not want to see you. You know what you did. It would be best for everyone if you were just to leave. My mother holds a newborn, her only begotten son. There is a pain in me, older than my father's blood. As a child, I can never quite make the connection between his fingers and my throat, and the anguish in his chest, a suffering older than my father's bones. His father's whiskey, grandfather's short temper, long-lived legacy to a time history does not care to remember, because beatings are not fit for scrapbooks, and genealogy's shame rarely make their way to the oral tradition of campfire. There is a burning in my heart that time cannot trace. Moved out from my father's, the suburbs treated me different. One day in the workforce, I told my boss, last night I met a woman. Beautiful and intelligent. Asked where at. Boyle Heights, where's that? The east side of Los Angeles. Asks incredulous, you met an intelligent woman in East Los Angeles? I wanted to slap the cavalry from the smirk. Beat the manifest destiny out of his name badge, but needing a paycheck, I stood in the weakness of silence, the pain and anguish of generations long past, alive and sickened in my chest. There is a shame attempted upon us, older than the tongues of bigots. Walked off job, marched off lot, fist up for the cause, because in a world that has told us no, that has told us different, I've chosen yes. Yes, I am Chicano. Yes, Mexicano. Yes, indigenous, I brown skin and bleed red. Yes, unafraid and unashamed, my passion, my potential, my intelligence. Yes, the fire in my chest. Look into my eyes, you could feel its strength. And yes, as a matter of fact, some of the most radiant, gifted, talented, beautiful, intelligent women I have ever met reside on the east side of Los Angeles, just across the steps from the streets where I was born. Yes, I am all of this and more. I, like you, am made of stars. You, like me, so full of pain, are brimming with genius. Listen to no one who would make you feel different. So I guess it's my set.
Thank you, Matt. That was a very powerful performance, and we appreciate you being here today. Thank you. So I would like to now shift everyone's attention to our very last speaker. I would like to now introduce Mr. Javier Cervantes. Javier Cervantes is the founder of Ultrasol Diversity Concepts, LLC, a consulting and training effort whose mission is to raise consciousness, awareness, and understanding about equity and justice through personal reflection, challenging dialogue that inspires self-work and transformation. Javier also serves as the current director of the Department of Institutional Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at Lynn Benton Community College. Previously, he was the Associate Dean of Student and Director of the Department of Student Diversity and Multicultural Affairs at Loyola University, Chicago. He also has worked at Oregon State University and Portland State University. His career has been dedicated to the development of students and professionals seeking understanding while exploring their own identity while navigating a very complex and diverse world. His passion is his work on transformational initiative geared at increasing cultural fluency, equity awareness, social justice, and diversity. Outside of his work, Javier is an active member of local and statewide efforts to bring people together while impacting systems to make them equitably responsive for all people. He served as the chair of the City of Albany Human Relations Commissions, as well as serving as the co-chair of the Inclusion of Diversity Consortium of Oregon Community Colleges. Javier also serves on the board of directors of the Oregon Humanities. The son of Mexican immigrants in search of better opportunities, Javier is the first in his family to graduate from high school and 3 institutions of higher education. Javier has degrees from East Los Angeles College in journalism, the University of Oregon in political science, Portland State University in public administration, and has substantial doctorate level credits at Oregon State University, focusing on community college leadership. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Javier Cervantes.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I couldn't have written that better myself, I gotta be honest. That's been pretty humbling to hear those words spoken from other people, so thank you so much. I'm actually a little bit humbled today because I have the luxury of coming back and presenting in a manner that is going to be a little different than what we've had today. I want to thank Tim Wise and Matt Sedillo for their inspiring and impactful words. For me, I have a lot to relate to with Matt's poetry, and the work that Tim has done has influenced the way I actually have evolved the work that I do as a practitioner. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna have a couple of interactive activities for you all. If we can get 209 people to respond to some questions here in a little bit. I'm gonna bring this home and try to round this out from Oregonians' perspective, especially having my own experience working or living in rural spaces as well, and having the luxury also of interacting and engaging in urban spaces. As I mentioned before, I know what it is to live in Los Angeles, or what was said before, I'd have an experience of living in Boyle Heights, what Matt was referring to earlier today, having graduated from Roosevelt High School. Before that, though, I lived in Cornelius, Oregon, in a rural setting before it was actually kind of a suburb. And then having also had the opportunity to live in Chicago, working there before coming back to Oregon. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to do that here in a second, so bear with me, and we'll get started here really quick. All right. So today's kind of topic of discussion is around this idea of people of color in rural spaces. I want to make absolutely certain that that you all understand what I mean by that, and having kind of an unapologetic essence of who you are, because the people who live in rural spaces that are people of color are essential. And there's this concept that somehow we can be overlooked and marginalized in a way that is kind of demeaning to our existence. So I call this the POCs in rural spaces unapologetically essential. Like I mentioned before, it's kind of a tough thing to actually go back and follow the words of Tim Wise and Matt Sedillo, but I'll do the best I can to keep you all engaged in a manner that is going to be kind of like a how-to in getting this. So with that said, I'm going to have you think about this as people who work in these spaces. I want folks, and I'm going to reinforce what Tim was talking about, is that equity work, anti-racism work, social justice work is the work of everyone. So those of you who happen to be white in this space today, this is your work too. Tim was talking about that earlier about when he was discussing white privilege. This is the work of every single person who is in this space. This is something that everybody has to acknowledge at some point or another in their life. If they haven't, they will encounter the essence of what the challenges that have been spoken through the examples of what Matt and Tim brought to the table. The way in which you engage this work, the way I've engaged this personally, is actually doing some really deep diving into who we are, right? Understanding who the self is, or who thyself is. A lot of folks actually want to go and say, well, we're not having this conversation enough, right? I don't even think we're actually thinking enough about it, quite frankly, before we actually have the conversations that we need to have, right? A lot of people haven't done the deep self-introspection to actually go and have these conversations with people who are different than them, because they haven't really got the chance to know who they are. So the question becomes, how do we do that? Where do we go deep within ourselves to figure out who we are, so we can actually find commonality with people who are different than us, right? So in rural spaces, folks say, well, you know, it's like we don't have enough people of color to actually have those conversations. Well, I'd actually ask you to seriously contemplate and to think about actually having a conversation, an internal work, do some research within yourself to find some of those conversations that you could actually have with folks who are different than you at some point when you actually engage, especially at a place like Eastern Oregon University. So how do we do this? I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by this. As I mentioned before, I've had the opportunity and I've had the luxury of growing up in a rural space. I grew up for 16 years outside of Portland. I was one of very few Mexican Americans, Chicanos, Hispanics, Latinos, Latinx persons that attended Forest Grove High School and the Forest Grove School District all the way up till I was 16 years old. I lived outside of Portland for that time as one of very few people of color, in particular Latinos, in that space. All throughout my life, I had to endure special reading classes, even though I was brought up in an educational system that inculcated reading from kindergarten on, right? So I understand what it is to be a person of color in white spaces in the white educational system. I had the luxury of then exploring my Mexican roots because my parents took us to Mexico on a regular basis. They would do this every 2 or 3 years, take us out of school, journey down to Mexico for our winter break, upsetting our teachers, so we can actually stay connected. What people don't realize when they're actually talking about the Latino experience, for example, is that we are actually very, very much wed and married to who we are, as Matt was talking about. Why? Because of proximity. Proximity to Mexico is something that never leaves us. Quite frankly, in one of Sedillo's poems, he's talking about the border. We didn't cross the border crossed us. The fact of the matter is that is true. The American Southwest is a ancestral homeland to many of us, right? Me and my exploration of who I am and exploring thyself actually has to acknowledge that, right? Acknowledge the fact that I actually come from and have been influenced by the rural spaces of Oregon and the rural spaces of an education that has taught me to think of myself in only a particular way. But then my parents are actually having another conversation, is to never forget who you are, right? My love affair with my identity has been influenced by my urban experiences as well. You'll notice the imagery there of Whittier Boulevard and the little flag with the heart around it for Chicago. These are two of my urban experiences that have influenced me dramatically. I became fortified in my identity when I actually moved to Los Angeles, having lived in Mexico after my parents moved there when I was 16. I moved to East Los Angeles at the age of 17. On my 17th birthday, I actually decided to move away from my parents when they went back to Mexico, and I ended up in East Los Angeles, in Boyle Heights. That to me fortified my upbringing and my identity as a person of color. First time in my life that I got to experience what white folk get to experience, the obliviousness of being like everyone else, right? Chicago was a very similar experience because Chicago is a very multicultural city as a professional later on in life. It was important for me to be able to actually understand what it is to have privilege of not having to identify as a Mexican American, because everyone I was around was a person of color, which was an unbelievable feeling of just being normal, in quote, right? These are all kinds of things that you put into an equation of exploring thyself, right? Then you actually start looking more internally to who influences you in life, right? So for me, I have the luxury of having a partner who is Salvadoran American. Her parents are from El Salvador. She has been probably one of the most influential people, other than my parents, in my existence as a human on this planet, almost for 50 years, right? Knowing thyself are the people who, just knowing who the people who have influenced you, as I mentioned. You multiply that by the family and ancestral history that you have, right? For many Latinos like myself, and perhaps you start looking and taking a deep dive into who you are, you actually start looking at your family and who has influenced you by your family, right? And then you obviously have other influences. And for me, a major influences for me are my canine children that I have in this imagery. So I want to make sure people realize that you can actually have influences of peace and unconditional love that is actually demonstrated by the other things in your life that are very important. This is all to say, and this is very important for people who want to know thyself, is that you want to find a balance, right? You want to find some harmony in your life. I can tell you that if you forget any one of these elements in your life, the places where you're from, the people who have influenced you, the people who have come into your life and shared their story and their narrative, any one of those things, the elements of who we are as people, the places we have been, the places that have influenced us, that will, if any of those things are out of tune, out of harmony, your day will probably become much more challenged. Your life becomes challenged, right? You actually start seeing the disruptions of not being able to actually have harmony. So it's important to know yourself before you actually start trying to know other people. Kind of like what Tim was talking about, not being oblivious in your own existence, because you have an existence, right? You are part of a larger community, and kind of like what Matt was referring to as having proximity to oppression, and what your role is in that proximity. So with that said, I want to make sure you understand that as well as you think you know yourself, there's still a lot more to learn, right? You have biases. The places and the people who have influenced you, the places, the people who you have had relationships with, have given you a lens, right? The lens intersect this lens in which we actually view the world. The biases we actually create are because of the things that we've been learned or conditioned to see, right? So I want to make sure that you can see what I'm talking about. And I'm going to have you all go through this exercise. And this is where it actually gets a little bit, I'm going to ask you all to actually be a little bit answering some questions for me in the chat window. And then I'm going to ask somebody, one of our hosts, to actually summarize what I ask you in this next exercise. So I'm going to ask you to put a yes or a no after this exercise in the chat window when I ask you a question, okay? The first thing I want you to do is think about implicit bias and equity. Everyone, right now, I would like for you to get comfortable where you're at. I would like for you to close your eyes and focus on my voice and solely on my voice. When I say this particular word, I want you to imagine what that word looks like in your mind, okay? I'm gonna ask you this question very, very quickly. I want you to breathe very, I want you to breathe very intentionally and deeply imagine what this word looks like. So the word that I'm going to ask you to focus on is the word corn. Close your eyes, breathe, breathe and focus on your deep breath. And when I say the word corn, slowly, what do you smell? What do you feel? The word is corn. What do you smell? What do you feel? When you take a bite into corn, what do you taste? What are the expressions going through your sensations, going through your body when you actually take that bite of corn? Maybe you like it. Perhaps you don't. What do you see? What is the environment? The word is corn. Breathe through that very quickly. I'm very intentionally, I'm sorry. Breathe through that. So, open your eyes. And this is where I want this to be a little interactive. So my host, whoever my host is there, our master of ceremony, can you tell me when I put in to, when folks put into the chat, if people agree with what this image looks like in their mind? So when I asked you what corn looked like, did you see this image? Put yes, or put Y for yes, N for no, when I asked you about corn. Did you see this image? Y for yes, N for no. Okay, that's about 25 responses. That's a poor response rate for 200 people, but that's okay. What master of ceremonies is the majority of the answers? Are they mostly Y's or are they mostly no's or N's?
So majority of the answers were yes.
Okay, perfect, excellent. Now, next question for the group. When I said the word corn, how many of you saw this image? Answer yes, Y for yes, N for no. Y for yes, N for no, if you saw this as your image for corn. Still getting some answers, that's great. This is an interactive activity here, seeing how many people are paying attention.
Hey, Javier, the chat is actually disabled for our attendees, so we're going to advise everyone to answer in the Q&A
Okay,
chat.
that's fine. That's fine, that's perfect. That's where people are doing it, so that's cool. Thank you. So what's the outcome on that? Mostly yes or no's?
So we've got mostly no's and a couple of.
Perfect, okay, excellent. So everybody was seeing this so far and not seeing that. How about this? In the Q&A section, how many people saw this image when they heard the word corn? Okay, what are we getting? Hosts?
We're getting a majority of no's.
Okay, perfect, that's fine. There's no right or wrong answers here. Who saw this? Yes or no, Y or N? In the Q&A section, Y or N? There we go, now we're starting to see people respond. What are we getting here for this, hosts?
We're also getting a majority of no's.
Perfect, okay, excellent. Just going like I thought. Who saw that? Who saw this? Yes or no's, Y or N in the question and answer section of the windows. What do we got, hosts? What are we getting?
So it's 50-50 on no's and yes.
All right, that's awesome. That's perfect. That's exactly what I want people to think about. All right. Well, how many people saw this? These are tortillas here. If you didn't recognize them, now you do in a particular image. How many people saw that? Yes or no in the Q&A portion of this? What are we getting, folks? What are we getting, hosts?
Okay, so we're also getting a majority of no's.
No's. Okay, that's fine. No problem. No judgment here. What about this? This image. This is an image of cornbread. Did you think of this when I said the word corn?
We're also getting no's.
No's. Okay, very good. This is the last image I'll share with you. How many people saw this when they saw the word corn? Or heard the word corn, sorry. How many thought about tacos? What's the verdict, hosts?
Okay, we're also getting no's.
Okay, that's perfectly fine. Who here thinks that any of these answers are wrong? There are no wrong answers to any of these images when you hear the word corn. Why? Because this is no more true or no less true than this image, than this image, than this image, than that image, than that image, or this, or this. The reason I ask you these questions is because the brain is conditioned to see what we deem as common. Most of us saw this as common. Some of us saw this as common. Not very many of us. Some of us saw this. Few people saw that. Some saw that. 50-50 saw that. Right? Some saw this. This is what we're taught to be familiar. This particular image is what we're taught to be familiar, right? We categorize objects in our mind as people, as ideas that go through our mind and our brain, right? We categorize them. So when we hear something or we see something that seems to be a little different or odd or strange or something that you want to learn more about, sometimes we come in and say, well, I want to learn more about that. Or I have a particular thought about that. I have a particular thought of something as being normal to me, right? Even though we may be seeing the same thing or hearing the same thing, it isn't necessarily the case. These would be called preferences or biases that we have, right? This is a way in which these biases are what we have been taught to understand or taught to know. The question is, what do we do when we know we have these biases, right? What can be done to mitigate these things? Everything that I shared with you in this particular exercise, you can call an implicit bias, kind of stuff that actually leads to the problems that we have engaged with that have been highlighted by what Tim Wise was talking about earlier today, right? We're conditioned to see certain things as normal, and it's perfectly fine because, like I said, none of these things can be said that cannot be called corn, because all of these have elements of corn in them. So as I mentioned before, preferences and biases, we all have them, right? Preferences are not inherently bad. Biases are not inherently bad either. Preferences are defines who we are, what we like, and how we make our choices. Preferences lead to biases, and basically an inclination or a leaning towards a certain object or a belief or activity or persons, right? We all have preferences and biases. The middle portion is where we actually start finding ourselves getting in more trouble, right? When we have preferences and biases, the question that I want you to contemplate and to think about is, do you prejudge those preferences or biases? Do you prejudge on the basis of someone not seeing these images, for example, or people, or places, or things, right? Preferences and biases are perfectly normal. The prejudice is where we start actually making judgments on them. The problems that you're going to experience when we have them is if you actually start actively acting on these particular preferences, biases, or prejudices, which would be called discrimination. And more systemically, it would be oppression. This is the stuff that I want folks to really seriously think about, because preferences and biases are inherently okay as long as you acknowledge them. I want people to think about preferences as biases as things that we can actually manage and mitigate for if you own up to them. If you start feeling like you judge them, go deep within yourself and ask yourself why. Why am I having this conversation? This is why I had you actually listen to my story a little bit when it comes to actually knowing yourself. What do I prefer? What are some of the biases? What are some of the environmental influences in my life? Who has influenced my life, right? These prejudices actually come out this way. On a systemic level, discrimination and oppression can get us into some serious problems. Systemic discrimination will get you a lawsuit. Oppression, you will find yourself in jail, most instances, right? So I want folks to focus on this for a second while I actually move us on to the next element of the presentation, which will be kind of like defining terms. Tim has defined terms, did a really good job of setting up what those terms look like. So individual racism, for example, we probably know what these are on a regular basis. We know what it looks like, what it feels like when we see individual racist acts happen, right? It's a conscious or unconscious attitude, acts or beliefs that actually act themselves out in the ways in which they come out in racial slurs, microaggressions, racial mistreatment. Okay, this is how I would actually define individual racism here. Cultural racism. Practices where cultural norms, for example, of people of color are deemed as inferior. I would actually call this the act of pathologizing particular cultures. And what I mean by pathologizing cultures is actually saying that people are more inherently prone to, for example, criminality. That's pathologizing a particular culture, right? You heard Matt Sedillo talk about one of his poems, Donald Trump's example of rising to power because of the pathology that Mexicans were lazy or they were drug dealers, right? Or that, for example, Black women have bad attitudes. That's pathologizing a culture. We need to actually pay attention to what that means or what that looks like and how the negative stereotypes influence cultural racism. Environmental racism. This is something as a newer, this has happened historically, but we never really had a word for it. Rules and regulations and policies that deliberately target communities of color for actually having access or having toxicity and hazardous waste levied on communities of color, right? For example, you don't see very many in urban settings or in probably rural settings for that matter. You see food deserts, having to travel more than 15 miles to find a supermarket to get healthy food, for example. The pollution in urban areas and some of the very rural areas. When you drive on I-84 going east from Portland into Eastern Oregon, you know that you go through particular areas where Native American populations live. You'll also notice some of the hazardous wastes that is actually trafficked in that particular corridor, right? You want to actually pay attention to that. That's what environmental racism looks like. Matt Sedillo referenced in one of his poems Chavez Ravine. And if you don't know where Chavez Ravine is, if you're a fan of baseball, the LA Dodgers play in Dodger Stadium in Chavez Ravine, right, in East Los Angeles, or in eastern part of Los Angeles, or the downtown area of Los Angeles. What you'll notice in Chavez Ravine is that it has a very violent history because that's where it was a Mexican-American enclave lived before the erection of Chavez Ravine and Dodger Stadium. It was a very violent period in the time of LA's history. That is environmental racism as an action. Institutional racism. We hear a lot about this now. Institutional racism are the norms and policies and practices that actually impact particular peoples of color and populations that are marginalized, that actually advantage white folk over the control for economic and political resources. For example, you have the education advantages that folks have had historically, as Tim Wise was talking about when he was bringing up his Princeton example, right? Employment preferences, people knowing the norms of what it is to be quote unquote professional, right? Access to healthcare. Right now, we're going through the global pandemic and the institutional racism that goes along with actually access to vaccines right now is being a deep conversation when it comes to who gets vaccines first, and because of disproportionate impact, right? Laws and the justice system is another example. Opportunity hoarding in leadership positions at institutions. Leadership hoarding is an opportunity where we actually focus on people that we have preferences for, that we have preferences on hiring for, right? Most of us hire people who look like us, or in this case, mostly a predominantly white institution are more comfortable doing that, right? It's something that intersects, quite frankly, individual racism can intersect with institutional racism. And what I mean by that is that acts of individual racism can actually dictate what an institutional culture looks like if we don't expand our searches for people to work at our institutions, right? So these are some of the definitions. I'll leave you with this last one, this unlearning. And why I say unlearning, it's important for us to realize what this unlearning looks like. A lot of us would actually constitute this unlearning or actually re-educating ourselves, getting skills for us to actually start thinking about uncolonizing or decolonizing our experiences, right? Decolonization. Why is this important? Well, if you're a person who wants to be a lifelong learner, anybody who's wanting to be interested in learning, you have to start thinking and start questioning some of the histories and conditions in which people grew up in. I'll go back to Matt Sedillo's poem, one of his first poems, where he's talking about, decolonization or colonization, and how we've actually grown up learning particular things, or what has been left out of our educational system, right? He talks a lot about, in his poetry, the affirmation of Chicano history, right? Right now we're in Black history. We opened up our session today with an acknowledgement of Black History Month. We opened up our history. We opened up the session with the acknowledgement of land acknowledgements for our Native American brothers and sisters, right? This is a way in which all of us are actually relearning to have humility and understanding for other people, right? The people who we don't see as us because they don't look like us, or they don't act like us, or they don't behave the way we want them to behave. This is kind of a process of decolonizing who we are, right? Because what we deem as normal, going back to my example on the corn, we deem as normal what we see as familiar, right? So if everybody sees that ear of corn as being yellow, and you're faced with somebody who says the maize of Central Mexico, where it's multicultural, you're saying, well, that's kind of interesting. How is that corn too? But quite frankly, it is. It is actually a more authentic version of what corn is, because that's what corn looked like before we had it actually evolve into what we call normal today in the United States, which is yellow, by the way. I want folks to think about oppression and the definition of oppression, right? Oppression is defined as the systemic and pervasive mistreatment of individuals on the basis of their membership in a disadvantaged group. It involves the imbalance of power and one's groups benefiting from systemic exploitation of the other groups. It occurs in several levels, and actually this is where the definitions that I've talked about, the interpersonal or the personal, right? The personal examples of how actually individual acts of oppression can actually work. The cultural levels, as I mentioned before, pathologizing people. The institutional and structural issues that I was mentioning about having some preferences in how we hire folks, or who's led into particular institutions that actually are the basis for structural racism. They actually are interchangeable, those last two. Okay, I want you to look at that, and I want you to sit on that for a second, and take that in, and what and how oppression looks like. So this is the next slide I want to actually share with you is actually challenging folks to think about addressing systemic structural institutional racism and how we actually go about that. Most recently, I've been experiencing, and I've had the opportunity to have folks talk about growth mindset, right? Is the fact that we can actually overcome whatever is put in front of us, right? It's a way in which we have in our academy, and I mean academy by the institutions of higher education, say, well, you just need to just power through, right? Power through and get through some of the traumas that you've actually experienced. Don't be set in a fixed mindset, right? A fixed mindset basically saying that I am where I am, and I have no place to grow, right? You want to actually see where we can go from being from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. However, in order to overcome the challenges that we are talking about in these two examples, you have to consider the following. And this is what our two speakers today talked about, or discussed a little bit. You got to speak to the lingo that people understand. So what do I mean by that? The systems language is about data. A lot of us want to actually see that data-driven outcomes. People want to see numbers. They want to see proof and evidence, right? Here's one thing that people don't consider data often. Not often enough. It is data, but they don't consider it often enough. And it's testimony, the story of you. This goes back to my question about know thyself. Testimony and your narrative and your history is just as important as the statistical data that we can collect on a spreadsheet. It's just as important, if not more important, because if you think about data in a manner that is kind of like a coloring book, the data that people usually want are all the empty lines in that coloring book that haven't been filled in with color, right? The story and testimony of who we are is the color that fills in those lines in that coloring book, right? Where you've come from, who influenced you, what you've overcome, right? Those are some of the things that I want folks to think about, how we can actually move to a growth mindset when we're actually conditioned to think that we are a certain way. Always remember your story, and your existence is your testimony, right? It is not all anecdotal. And this is one of those things that a lot of statisticians or people who are data heads and things of that sort will say, well, that's just one story. That's just one anecdote. Well, quite frankly, that anecdote is part of a bigger picture, because multiple stories or multiple anecdotes actually leads to a phenomenon, kind of like a phenomena, right? You can actually triangulate all that information if you have multiple stories of survival of what we've actually experienced when it comes to institutional and structural racism, right? Or discrimination, or overcoming, right? Having that growth mindset. Your story is just as important as the data that is actually presented in a spreadsheet. And I want people to really take that in, because what we need to do is share what those testimonies are and present them in the lingo that statisticians and people who are leading our institutions say they are, which is data, right? Testimony is data. Being in a rural space does not mean you're alone. So this is what I want folks to actually find is actually, if you don't see community, create the community. There are people who have a lot of similarities to you. You just have to find them. It's a lot of self-work, a lot of hard work to do that. Your resiliency is just as dependent on the environment that we are able to create. Don't do it alone, right? Let me say that again. Your resiliency is dependent on your environment you create or you're able to find, right? Research has demonstrated that resiliency isn't just an internal process for people. Resiliency is based on environmental factors around us. And what I mean by that is at an institutional level, what services do we provide to the students that we serve or being served that actually make resiliency that much more possible? Where are they accessing it? What kind of cultural capital are we giving our first generation students coming to our institution of higher education, for example, at Eastern Oregon University, to make sure that they understand all the acronyms we use at our institutions of higher education? Understanding that office hours aren't very familiar to first generation students because they never had their parents or their folks in their family actually attend a university. It may seem very basic for those of us working in higher ed, but it is actually kind of a profound thing to think about, the experiences that students don't have, what they don't have access to, and we can't blame them for that, right? We need to actually take responsibility in educating our students to have the cultural capital for them to be successful and therefore have resiliency. All of this is to say that it's all intersectional. It's all intersectional, right? Seeking racial justice, social justice, disability justice, LGBTQ rights, environmental justice, appreciating what feminism has contributed to the academy, all intersect at some point. You don't do these on their own. People are very much like an onion. You peel back one layer and you find out that you're interested in other things, right? You want to realize that you have multiple ways of knowing, multiple ways of seeing, right? Some of the research that I've been reading recently is conocimientos, right? Understanding, or the process of knowing, right? You bring a lot to the table. You bring a lot to the table as a first generation person who's been to college. Intersect that, or actually lay on top of that what you've overcome with regards to some of the racial injustices that people have faced, or the privileges people have, right? What happens if you actually overlay that with the idea that you are realizing or coming out in your own story with regards to your sexual orientation and who you share that with, right? Or happens to be that you might be disabled, right? Or happens to be that you come from a place that is rural, that has been impacted by by environmental injustice. For example, the pipeline issue that happened in the center of our country that impacted our Native American brothers and sisters, right? These are all things that I want people to realize, that there is no such thing as a single issue or struggle, that we do not live single issue lives. We're multi-layered, as Audre Lorde says, right? It's important for us to understand that tapestry of who we are. So here's some more advice that I would give for folks to actually look at DEI work, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just being a POC thing, right? It's an everyone's thing. Here's how you actually start impacting systemic and cultural shifts at the institutional level. Start thinking about inclusion, but actually moving that into belonging. Moving from inclusion to belonging is is a very important realization that we have for folks. Minoritized people want to belong. They want to see themselves as successful. They want to see themselves as being part of the organization in which they've applied to be. Move on from that. Validate their experiences. These are things that those of us that work in the academy, and those of us that work at Eastern Oregon, Lynn Benton Community College, Reed College, the Willamette University, we should and actually should be striving to validate the experiences of the people that are coming to us, rather than actually having them only think about how they can fit into our culture. We need to actually redress that and actually go back and think about how we fit in, how we actually have their experiences validated on what they bring to us in the classroom. This will actually go to this idea and this notion of self-esteem, adequacy, and imposter syndrome, right? The idea of these three things here is that many students, because they are actually first generation or a person of color in predominantly white spaces, actually come in with this idea that they don't belong in our spaces, right? They come in with this idea that that actually impacts their self-esteem in a manner that is detrimental to their ability to actually be successful in our spaces, because, for example, we don't have the environmental services that actually help them find the adequacy or the community they need to be retained and be successful and find the grit that we want them to have, right? That's incumbent upon us to actually address the self-esteem issues and validating the experiences and bringing people into belonging. Approach minoritized students and employees, and this goes to the employees of color that you have in your spaces as assets, that they bring something to the table. They're not asking for anything additional. They're not asking for special privileges. They're only asking for what is fair and what is right, right? If you get an opportunity to promote a person of color at your institution, I think you actually have an opportunity to bring and actually make your table larger, right? Minoritized students want to feel like they are contributing to the learning communities of in the classrooms of which they sit, right? This is very important for students of color to feel that this kind of validation is part of the student experience. Folks appreciate data, as I mentioned. Find different ways of actually bringing that data out. And as I mentioned before, the stories and the testimony of individuals is just as important as the data that we see as traditional. But show them how to, for example, show them how to do things. Share your story, like I did earlier today with sharing a little bit of my own personal story of knowing thyself, right? Those of you who are teaching students in class or have them in your spaces, it is important for us, it's an incumbent for us to actually see them come back, because they can actually relate to a story that you may have. For example, if you come from a rural space, right, and you actually are teaching in a space that is, or that you're a first generation individual having succeeded in college yourself, share that information with students. Share how you actually overcame some of the challenges that you did, even regardless of your background. Students will latch on to something that you have in common. It could be as simple as some of the sports that you like to watch, for example. A team you may have, for example. Going out to the football game when we're actually able to do that together as being part of the community. It's important to show students how to do that, how you actually found that capacity and community. Foster relationships is basically an outcome of what I'm mentioning here. Fostering those relationships is held in high regard when it comes to students of color and first generation students. It is so important that you can actually do that. I'll share with you a personal story where I actually found somebody who gave a damn about me. It was when I was going to East LA College. I lived away from my parents. My parents were able to give me a couple $100s a month to help me pay for some rent and pay for some food. Everything else I had to figure out on my own. And I didn't know how to actually look for a job necessarily. At that particular time, I was 17 years old, moving into a different city, moving from Cornelius, rural Oregon, into an urban space. Didn't figure that out for a while. I actually was going hungry for about 10 days out of the last 10 days out of every month. I was actually looking for food in places on campus. When my journalism advisor actually brought me into her office hours. Didn't even know that's what they were called. And she actually said, "Are you doing okay? I see you losing a lot of weight. Are you all right?" Now, I'm not advocating for people to give students money. I'm not advocating for that, but actually sharing she shared her story of her struggle with me, and actually offered me some positions to actually do some work on campus with regards to my journalism experience. I actually became the editor of the paper that actually got me some stipend money. I am eternally grateful for the relationship she fostered with me, because she gave a damn. She cared about me enough to share an opportunity for me to earn my own way, to learn how to work a little bit in a different way, work in a white person's space, even though that was East Los Angeles College that is predominantly a Hispanic school, right? But nobody cared enough other than this particular journalism advisor. And by the way, that person that I actually am talking about, her name is Jean Stapleton. It's not a person who has a Latino last name, first name for that matter. So this relationship can be fostered by anybody if you care, right? If we all care that way, which I know a lot of us do. The last couple of things that I'll mention to you is all of us is to ask who's included at the table, making decisions, right? This idea of institutional racism that happens or based off of prejudices that we have is kind of like a fire that's out of control. We didn't start this fire, but it's all of our jobs to put it out, right? As the song says, Billy Joel from back in the 80s. I'll conclude where I began. Be unapologetically who you are. You're resilient as you are. Every one of you who are attending this particular presentation, you are resilient. You are essential to your community and create that community, right? Find the places where you can actually fit in. No one is going to believe in you as much as you believe in yourself. That is a fact. You have to believe in yourself. And if you don't believe in yourself, find the actual environmental resources to help you get to the place where you do. Because I can tell you from my own personal story and my own personal story of overcoming, that I had to believe that I could actually accomplish, that I had a right to be in the space that I actually occupied. I had a right to be in my university. I had a right to be in my community college. I had a right to be in my master's program. I had a right to be in my doctoral program. Your testimony is valid and it is data. And for the professionals in the room, it is important, it's your role to push for systemic and cultural change at your organizations. That is your role. That is your challenge. The challenge for the students in this space is that you need to share your story because it's valid. Your testimony is valid. If you do not tell your own story, other people will tell it for you, or it won't be told at all. This is some sage advice that I got from my friend, from both my friends last night. As a matter of fact, when I was finally putting the final touches on this particular presentation, from Brian Miyagishima and Diana Inch, who work with me at my institution at Lynn Benton. If you do not tell your own story, other people will tell it for you, or it won't be told at all. So with that said, I'll stop the share. And let's see. How do we stop the share? Here we go. There we go. And if there are any questions or comments, I'll be happy to take them. Mind you, I am not Tim Wise or I am not Matt Sedillo. You know, my style is very different because I'm a practitioner and as an administrator. So I don't profess to be a poet or a tremendous speaker like any of those, but I have my own story to share in that regard. So I appreciate the time that you've given me to actually share a little bit. I'll give it back to you folks.
Thank you so much, Javier, for that very engaging presentation, and thank you to all the attendees that participated throughout. And as we conclude our event today, I just want to take a moment to thank our fiscal sponsors for their continued support of the C.E.A.D Conference, and that would include the EOU Student Council of Multicultural Affairs, EOU Office of Student Diversity and Inclusion, the EOU Diversity Committee, and the EOU Vending Committee. And again, we just want to thank all of our speakers, Tim Wise, Sedillo, and Javier Cervantes, for being here to share their work, research, knowledge, and experiences with us. And we are so grateful for their help in making this event a great success. And most of all, we want to thank all of you for being a part of this year's conference. We are grateful for your support and commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Finally, on behalf of the C.E.A.D Conference Planning Committee, we invite you to continue your learning, growth, and commitment to equity and inclusion by creating safe, inclusive spaces that allow for the momentum for the C.E.A.D to continue in your classrooms, workspaces, dinner tables, and in your home.
Okay, so at the beginning of the conference, we share that we will be continuing the conversations in smaller groups. If you would like to join us, you'll need to leave this main meeting link and enter another Zoom session using the link you see on your screen, and also post it in the Q&A box. You can also find this link in the confirmation email you received yesterday with the subject line C.E.A.D Registration Confirmation. Again, I thank you all for being here. And if you are able to join us in the post-C conversation, we will regroup at our post-C conversation in 5 minutes. If you decide to end your time with us now, we hope to connect with you in partnership soon. Please continue to be well and be safe. And I thank you all again very much and have a great rest of your weekend.